Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Franklin Ashworth, but everyone calls me Flint. I've been a park ranger for 15 years now, working up in the Chattahoochee National Forest in Georgia. Most folks think being a ranger is all about giving directions to lost hikers and putting out campfires. But I do something different. I study animals, especially the dangerous ones. I have a PhD in wildlife behavior. Before I became a ranger, I spent years hunting with my daddy in these same mountains. I know how every animal moves, sounds, and smells. I've tracked bears, wild boars, and even a few mountain lions that wandered down from up north. I've written papers about animal behavior that other scientists actually read. I thought I knew everything about what lived in these woods. I was wrong. It was April 1976, and the spring storms were hitting hard. Brasstown Bald, that's the highest mountain in Georgia at 4,784 feet, was getting hammered with rain and wind. The Cherokee used to call it Inota, which means high place. They thought it was sacred. I always figured that was just old stories. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. 2 hikers had been found near the summit, unconscious and bleeding from their ears. No visible injuries, the report said. Just blood coming from their ears, and they couldn't hear anything when they woke up. The local hospital was confused. Both hikers had burst eardrums, but there were no signs of trauma to their heads. Probably got too close to a sonic boom, said Jim Martinez from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. He was my contact for weird wildlife cases. Military jets sometimes break the sound barrier over the mountains. But I knew better. I'd heard plenty of sonic booms in my time. They don't sneak up on you. You see the jet first, then hear the boom. These hikers were found in thick woods where you can't see the sky. I drove up the winding road to Brasstown Bald that afternoon. The storm had washed out part of the observatory road, so I had to hike the last 2 miles. The woods felt wrong from the moment I stepped out of my truck. Too quiet. In 15 years of walking these mountains, I'd never heard silence like this. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted, like the mountain was holding its breath. I've got good ears, better than most people. It comes from years of listening for animal sounds in the wild. But that day, all I could hear was my own footsteps on the wet leaves and my heart beating in my chest. The hikers had been found near the old Cherokee Trail that leads to the summit. I walked the same path, looking for any sign of what might have hurt them. Bear tracks? No. Boar signs? Nothing. Not even broken branches or disturbed ground where they might have fallen. I pulled out my sound equipment, a Nagra tape recorder, and some Sennheiser microphones I used for studying animal calls. I always recorded the sounds of any place where something strange happened. You'd be surprised what you can learn from listening to a recording that you missed when you were there. I set up my equipment and started recording. For 20 minutes, I got nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the distant drip of water from the trees. Then, just as I was about to pack up, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. So faint, I almost missed it. Like someone calling from very far away, but there was nobody else on the mountain. I checked my equipment. The needles on my sound meters were barely moving. Whatever made that sound was at the very edge of what human ears can detect. I packed up my gear and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. Something was living on that mountain that didn't belong in any textbook I'd ever read, and it had hurt those hikers with no thing but sound. That night, I called Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a biologist friend of mine who worked with the DNR. Elena was smart and tough, and she'd helped me with several animal attack investigations over the years. Burst eardrums with no trauma, she said when I told her about the hikers. That's impossible, Flint, unless they were standing next to a jet engine when it started up. I know it sounds crazy, I said, but I recorded something up there today, something that whispered just at the edge of hearing. I've never heard anything like it. Bring me the tape tomorrow, Elena said. Let's see what we're dealing with. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about that silence on the mountain, and that whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In all my years studying predators, I'd learned one thing. The most dangerous animals are the ones you never see coming. Elena's office was in the DNR building in Athens, about an hour south of the mountains. She had fancy sound analysis equipment that could break down animal calls into their basic parts: frequency, duration, pitch changes. We'd used it before to identify different types of owl calls and bat echolocation. "Play me the tape," she said, adjusting her headphones. I rewound to the part where I'd heard the whisper. Elena listened with her eyes closed, the way she always did when concentrating on sounds. After a few minutes, she frowned and looked at her equipment. "Flint, this is picking up frequencies way below what humans can normally hear, and way above, too. Look at this." She pointed to the screen showing the sound analysis. "Most of what you recorded is infrasound, below 20 hertz. That's what elephants use to communicate over long distances." "What could make sounds like that in Georgia?" I asked. "Nothing I know of," Elena said. "And there's something else. The pattern suggests intelligence. This isn't random noise. Something was trying to communicate." "With who?" "Maybe with you." That gave me chills. Elena printed out the sound analysis and handed it to me. "I want to come up there with you tomorrow. Bring more equipment. If there's an unknown animal on Brasstown Bald, we need to document it properly." We drove up the mountain the next morning in Elena's DNR truck, loaded with recording equipment, cameras, and binoculars. The road was still partly washed out, but her truck could handle the rough spots better than my old pickup. The silence hit us again as soon as we got out of the truck. Elena noticed it immediately. "This is unnatural," she said, looking around at the empty trees. "Where are all the birds?" "That's what I was thinking yesterday," I said. "In spring, these woods should be full of songbirds, warblers, thrushes, woodpeckers, but they're all gone." We hiked up to the spot where the hikers had been found. Elena set up her equipment while I searched for any physical evidence we might have missed. Still nothing. No tracks, no scat, no territorial markings of any kind. "Flint, come listen to this," Elena called. She had her headphones on and was pointing at her sound meter. The needle was jumping around like it was picking up signals, but I couldn't hear anything. "There's definitely something broadcasting on frequencies we can't detect," she said. "It's like sonar, but more complex. Almost like—" She never finished that sentence, because that's when we heard the first real scream. It came from somewhere above us, near the summit. The sound hit us like a physical blow. I felt it in my chest, in my bones, in my teeth. Elena ripped off her headphones and staggered backward, her hands over her ears. The scream went on for maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. Not a roar, not a howl, not a shriek. It was like a human voice, but wrong. Too powerful, too pure, too full of rage and pain. When it stopped, the silence that followed was even worse than before. "What the hell was that?" Elena whispered. Her face was pale and she was shaking. I checked my equipment. The sound meters had gone off the scale. The needles were pinned at maximum. "Whatever made that sound, it's louder than a jet engine," I said. "But it didn't hurt us," Elena said. "Not like it hurt those hikers. Maybe because we were farther away. Or maybe it was just a warning." Elena started packing up her equipment with shaky hands. "We need to get out of here, Flint. Right now." But as we hurried back down the trail, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. A warning. That scream had felt directed at us, like something telling us to leave its territory. When we got back to the truck, Elena's hands were trembling so badly she could barely start the engine. "I've never felt anything like that," she said. "It was like that sound went right through my skull." "We need to analyze the recording," I said. "Find out exactly what we're dealing with." "No," Elena said firmly. "We need to report this to the university and let someone else handle it. This is way beyond normal wildlife management." But I knew I couldn't just walk away. Something was living on my mountain, something that could hurt people with just its voice. As a ranger, it was my job to protect hikers and campers. I couldn't do that if I didn't understand what I was protecting them from. That evening, I called Jim Martinez at the DNR. "Jim, I need you to close the upper trails on Brasstown Bald, temporarily, until we can figure out what's going on up there. What kind of animal are we talking about, Flint? I don't know yet, but it's dangerous. It uses sound as a weapon. There was a long pause. Sound as a weapon? What are you talking about? Those hikers yesterday? Something screamed at them so loud it burst their eardrums. Elena and I heard it today. If we'd been any closer, we'd be in the hospital too. All right, Jim said finally. I'll put up some temporary barriers on the high trails. But I need a full report by Friday. If you can't identify this thing by then, I'm calling in a team from the University of Georgia. I had 3 days to figure out what was living on Brasstown Bald. 3 days to understand something that shouldn't exist. That night I couldn't get the sound of that scream out of my head. It was like it had left an echo in my skull. And I kept thinking about what Elena had said, that the infrasound patterns suggested intelligence. Something up there was smart enough to use its voice as a weapon, smart enough to know we were trespassing in its territory, smart enough to be hunting us. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream echoing in my head. By 4 a.m., I gave up and made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table going over everything I knew about dangerous animals. Bears could be aggressive, but they roared and growled. They didn't produce focused sonic attacks. Mountain lions screamed too, but nothing like what we'd heard. And no North American animal used infrasound for hunting, unless it wasn't a North American animal. I drove back up to Brasstown Bald alone that morning. I know Elena would have been mad if she knew, but I had to understand what we were dealing with. I parked at the same spot and hiked up, carrying just a small tape recorder and a pair of industrial ear protectors I'd borrowed from a construction site. The mountain was still unnaturally quiet, but this time I noticed something else wrong. The trees. About a quarter-mile up the trail, I found the first one. A big oak tree with its bark stripped away in a perfect spiral pattern, like someone had used a giant lathe to peel it. The exposed wood underneath was smooth as glass. I'd never seen anything like it. Bears sometimes claw bark off trees to mark territory, but this was too precise, too clean. It looked almost decorative. I found 6 more trees like this as I climbed higher, all stripped in the same spiral pattern, all perfectly smooth underneath. Whatever was doing this had incredible strength and precision. Near the summit, I found something that made me stop cold. A dead black bear, lying in a small clearing. No obvious wounds, no signs of a fight. But when I got closer, I saw blood around its ears. The bear's eardrums had been burst, just like the hikers. I knelt beside the bear and examined it carefully. It was a big male, probably 300 pounds, healthy-looking, well-fed. Nothing on earth should have been able to kill this animal with just sound. But something had. I was just starting to back away when I heard it. That whisper again, so faint it might have been wind in the trees. Except there was no wind. I put on the ear protectors and pulled out my tape recorder. This time I was going to get a clear recording, no matter what. The whisper came again, a little louder. Then again. Each time it seemed to be coming from a different direction, like something was moving through the trees around me. I started walking toward the summit, following the sound. The whispers got clearer as I climbed. They sounded almost like words, but in no language I recognized. The rhythm was too regular to be random noise. Near the top of the mountain, I found the source. There was a cave opening I'd never seen before, hidden behind a cluster of rhododendron bushes. The whispers were coming from inside. I approached carefully, recorder in one hand, the other ready to run. The cave was deeper than it looked from outside. The whispers echoed off the walls, getting louder as they bounced around. But there was something else mixed in with them now, a low humming like power lines in the wind. I was about 10 feet from the cave mouth when the humming stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even my own breathing seemed to make sound. It was like the cave was absorbing every noise. Then something inside the cave took a breath. It was huge. The intake of air was like wind rushing through a tunnel. Whatever was in there had lungs the size of drums. I started back, away, but it was too late. The thing in the cave had heard me. The scream that came next was nothing like what Elena and I had heard the day before. This was focused, directed, meant to kill. Even with the ear protectors, it hit me like a hammer. The sound lifted me off my feet and threw me backward into a tree. I felt something warm running down my neck, blood from my ears. The ear protectors had helped, but they weren't enough. Through the ringing in my head, I heard movement in the cave, something big coming toward the entrance. I ran. I stumbled down the mountain trail, half deaf and dizzy. Behind me, I could hear branches breaking as something large moved through the forest. It was following me, but not quickly, like it knew I couldn't escape. Halfway down the mountain, the sounds of pursuit stopped. I kept running until I reached my truck, then drove straight to the hospital in Blue Ridge. The doctor who examined me was the same one who had treated the hikers. "Mr. Ashworth, you have partial hearing damage in both ears," he said. "What were you exposed to?" "I don't know," I lied. "Some kind of industrial accident." He didn't believe me, but he didn't push. He gave me some medication for the pain and told me to avoid loud noises for the next few weeks. When I got home, I called Elena. It took me 3 tries to dial the number correctly. The ringing in my ears was making it hard to concentrate. "Flint, you sound awful. What happened?" I told her about the cave, the dead bear, and the focused scream that had nearly killed me. "You went back up there alone?" she said. "Are you insane?" I had to. "Elena, this thing isn't just dangerous. It's intelligent. It was communicating with those whispers. And when it screamed at me, it knew exactly where I was standing." "What do you think it is?" I'd been asking myself the same question all afternoon. I think it's way at the Cherokee we're afraid of. Something that's been living on that mountain for a very long time. The Cherokee had stories about Brasstown Bald. I'm going to find out. There's an old Cherokee man named Joseph Crow Feather who lives down in Cleveland. He knows all the old stories about these mountains. If anyone can tell us what we're dealing with, it's him. "Flint, maybe we should just let the university team handle this." "No," I said. "This thing has already hurt 4 people that we know of. How many others have been up there and never made it back? How many missing hikers over the years that we blamed on bears or getting lost?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" "Help me research this. Find out everything you can about unknown animals that use sound as a weapon. I'm going to talk to Joseph Crow Feather and learn what the Cherokee knew about that mountain." "And then what?" "Then we figure out how to stop it." Joseph Crow Feather lived in a small house at the base of the mountains, about 20 miles from Brasstown Bald. I'd met him a few times over the years. He sometimes helped search and rescue teams navigate the old Cherokee trails. He must have been 80 years old, but his eyes were sharp and clear. When I told him why I'd come, his expression grew serious. "You went to the top of Enotah," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Something up there nearly killed me." Joseph nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me stories about that mountain, stories his grandfather told him. We were never supposed to go to the very top. That place belongs to the Screaming One." "The Screaming One?" "An old spirit, older than the Cherokee, older than any tribe. It guards the high places, the sacred peaks. Most of the time it sleeps, but when too many people disturb its rest, it wakes up and starts killing them." "Not killing," Joseph said. "Warning. The Screaming One gives 3 warnings. First, it makes the mountain go silent. All the animals flee. Second, it calls out in the old language, telling intruders to leave. Thitis. Ard, it screams loud enough to burst eardrums and break bones." "What happens after the 3rd warning?" Joseph's face was grim. "After that, it hunts." He went inside and came back with an old leather journal. My grandfather wrote down the old stories. "Here." He showed me a page covered with Cherokee writing and English translations. "The Screaming One is tall as 2 men, thin as winter, with a throat made for calling across the sky," I read aloud. "Its voice can shatter stone, stop hearts, make the earth tremble. It is the guardian of Enotah, and it will not let the sacred peak be defiled." "How do you stop it?" I asked. "You don't stop it," Joseph said. You appease it. You leave offerings at the cave mouth and promise to keep people away from the summit. But that only works if it hasn't started hunting yet. And if it has started hunting? Joseph closed the journal. Then you pray to whatever spirits you believe in, because the screaming one doesn't stop until every trespasser is dead. I drove back toward Brasstown Bald in the late afternoon, my mind racing. 4 people had been hurt so far. The 2 hikers, Elena and me, but none of us had been killed. Maybe the creature was still in warning mode. Elena met me at the DNR office. She had printouts of research from universities all over the world. I found something, she said. There are reports of similar creatures in other mountain ranges. The Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, always on the highest peaks, always described as using sound as a weapon. The Cherokee called it the screaming one. I told her about my conversation with Joseph. So it's a cryptid, Elena said, an unknown species that's managed to stay hidden by living in remote, high-altitude areas. Or it's exactly what the Cherokee said, an ancient spirit that guards sacred places. Elena looked at me like I'd lost my mind. You're a scientist? A Flint. You have a PhD. You can't seriously believe in ancient spirits. 3 days ago, I didn't believe in animals that could kill with sound waves either. But I've got permanent hearing. Damage that says I was wrong. That's when my radio crackled to life. It was Jim Martinez from the DNR. Flint, we've got a problem. 3 more hikers went missing on Brasstown Bald this afternoon. Local search and rescue found their car at the lower trailhead, but no sign of them on the mountain. Elena and I looked at each other. Jim, you need to close the entire mountain, I said. Not just the upper trails. The whole area. I can't do that without more evidence. The hiking groups are already complaining about the trail closures. If I shut down the whole mountain, they'll take it to the state legislature. Those hikers are probably dead, Jim. Then find me proof, and find it fast. Elena and I drove up to Brasstown Bald one more time as the sun was setting. This time, we brought everything. Sound equipment, cameras, night vision goggles, and a rifle loaded with tranquilizer darts. If we're lucky, we won't need any of it, I said as we parked at the trailhead. And if we're unlucky, then we try to get close enough to document this thing before it kills us. The mountain was darker than I'd ever seen it. No moon, no stars visible through the cloud cover. We used flashlights to follow the trail, but the beams seemed swallowed up by the surrounding darkness. We found the missing hikers about a mile up the trail. All 3 of them were unconscious, bleeding from their ears and noses. But they were alive. Barely. We need to get them to a hospital, Elena said, checking their pulses. Not yet, I said. Look around. Do you see any tracks? Any sign of how they got here? Elena shined her flashlight in a circle around the unconscious hikers. The ground was completely undisturbed except for their own footprints on the trail. It's like they just collapsed where they were walking, she said. That's when we heard the whispers. They were coming from all around us, echoing off the trees. But this time I could make out some of the words. They were in Cherokee. I recognized a few phrases from my conversation with Joseph. Leave, the voices whispered. Go away. Last warning. It's giving us a chance, I said. We can take the hikers and leave. But Elena was staring at something further up the trail. Flint, look! There was a figure standing about 50 yards away, just at the edge of our flashlight beams. It was impossibly tall and thin, like a skeleton stretched to 7 feet. Its throat was swollen and distended, easily twice the size of a normal human neck. The screaming one. It tilted its head and looked directly at us. Even in the darkness, I could see its eyes, pale and luminous, like moonlight on water. Then it opened its mouth and took a deep breath. Run, I said. We grabbed the unconscious hikers and started dragging them down the trail as fast as we could. Behind us, the creature's breathing got deeper and louder, like air being sucked into a cave. We were maybe 20 yards away when it screamed. The sound hit us like a physical wall. I felt my ribs crack, felt blood burst from my nose and ears. Elena collapsed, pulling one of the hikers down with her. The scream went on and on, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The trees around us started to shake, their branches snapping like twigs. Rocks tumbled down from higher up the mountain. When it finally stopped, the silence was complete. No wind, no insects, no sound of our own breathing. The mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, but we were alive. Hurt, but alive. "Why didn't it kill us?" Elena whispered. I looked back up the trail. The screaming one was gone, but I could feel it watching us from somewhere in the darkness. "Because we're leaving," I said. "And we're taking the others with us." It took us 2 hours to get all 3 hikers down to our truck, Kay, and another hour to drive them to the hospital. They were all unconscious with severe hearing damage, but the doctors said they would live. Elena and I sat in the hospital waiting room, trying to process what we'd seen. My ribs hurt with every breath, and the ringing in my ears had gotten worse. Elena kept touching her nose where blood had crusted around her nostrils. "We have to tell people," she said finally. "We have to warn them." "Who's going to believe us? That there's a 7-foot-tall creature on Brasstown Bald that can kill people with its voice?" "The evidence is right here," Elena said, gesturing toward the emergency room where the hikers were being treated. 5 people with identical injuries, all from the same location. I knew she was right, but I also knew how these things worked. The official report would blame industrial accidents, sonic booms, equipment malfunctions, anything except the truth. The next morning I called Jim Martinez and told him everything. The dead bear, the cave, the encounter with the screaming one. I left nothing out. "Flint," he said when I finished, "I'm going to recommend you take some time off. Get your hearing checked by a specialist. Maybe talk to someone about the stress of this job. Jim, you have to close the mountain permanently. I can't close a mountain based on stories about 7-foot-tall monsters. I need physical evidence, photos, video, something concrete. What about the hikers? What about my hearing damage?" "Industrial accident," Jim said. "There must be some kind of military testing going on in the area. Sonic weapons, maybe." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about what Joseph Crow Feather had told me. The screaming one was a guardian, protecting the sacred peak from intruders. It had given us every warning it could before attacking. Maybe the solution wasn't to fight it or capture it. Maybe the solution was to respect it. I drove back to Joseph's house that afternoon. He was sitting on his porch carving a piece of wood with a small knife. "You saw it," he said before I could speak. "Yes, sir. It let us live." "Why?" "Because you helped the injured ones. The screaming one isn't evil. It's just doing what it was made to do, protecting the mountain." "So how do we make peace with it?" Joseph set down his carving. "The old ways. We make an offering and ask for its protection instead of fighting against it." "What kind of offering?" "Something that shows respect. Something that proves we understand its purpose." 2 days later, I hiked back up Brasstown Bald one last time. I was alone, carrying a small bundle wrapped in Cherokee cloth that Joseph had given me. Inside were tobacco, sage, and a piece of jade, traditional Cherokee gifts for mountain spirits. I climbed all the way to the cave where I'd first heard the creature. The mountain was still unnaturally quiet, but it felt different now. Watchful, but not hostile. I set the bundle down at the cave entrance and stepped back. "I understand now," I said out loud. "This is your home, your sacred place. I won't bring anyone else here." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard a soft whisper from inside the cave. Not threatening this time, but almost grateful. I backed away slowly and walked down the mountain. When I reached my truck, I took one last look at the summit of Brasstown Bald. The screaming one was standing on the highest ridge, silhouetted against the sky. It raised one long arm in what might have been a farewell gesture, then disappeared into the trees. 3 weeks later, the state of Georgia officially closed the upper trails of Brasstown Bald due to unstable geological conditions. The official report mentioned nothing about sonic phenomena or missing hikers. But Jim Martinez made sure the closure was permanent. I never went back to the summit. My hearing never fully recovered. I still have constant ringing in my ears, and I can't hear high frequencies anymore. But it was a small price to pay for understanding something that most people will never believe exists. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear whispers on the wind, faint Cherokee words, carried down from the high places. The screaming one is still up there, still guarding its sacred mountain. And I sleep better knowing that some places in this world are still protected by older, deeper laws than the ones we write in our books. The Cherokee were right about Inota. Some mountains are not meant to be climbed, but they are meant to be respected. This account was found among the papers of Franklin Flint Ashworth after his death in 2003. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources maintains that the closure of Brasstown Bald's upper trails was due to geological instability and denies any connection to unexplained wildlife encounters. The trails remain closed to this day. My name is Vernon Hawthorne, but everyone calls me Grit. I've been a ranger in Alabama's Talladega National Forest for 22 years now. Before that, I spent 4 years in the war as a combat engineer, blowing up bridges and clearing paths through places that didn't want us there. Point is, I'm not the kind of man who scares easy or believes in things that go bump in the night. At least I wasn't. It was July 1961, and we were in the middle of the worst drought Alabama had seen in 50 years. The longleaf pines were dry as kindling, and every morning I'd climb up to Fire Tower 7, scanning the horizon for the first wisp of smoke that could turn into a wildfire. The tower sat on Chiaha Mountain, the highest point in Alabama, about 25 miles from the nearest paved road. Up there, you could see for miles in every direction, rolling green hills that stretched all the way to Georgia. But that summer, the green was turning brown. Creek beds that had flowed for 100 years were nothing but cracked mud. Springs that the old-timers said never went dry were just holes in the ground. The Creek Indians used to call this area sacred, said the mountain held the spirits of their ancestors. Now it looked more like a graveyard. I'd been doing controlled burns in the area for weeks, trying to clear out the undergrowth before it could catch fire naturally. It's dangerous work, but I knew what I was doing. In the war, I'd learned that fire was a tool. Respect it, and it would do what you needed. Get careless, and it would kill you. That's why I took the radio call seriously when it came in on July 15th. Sheriff Deputy Mike Collins was calling from down in Lineville, his voice crackling through the static. Grit, we got a situation up your way. Hikers found some bones near Devil's Den Trail. Human bones, arranged in circles. You know anything about old cemeteries up there? I checked my maps. Devil's Den was about 3 miles southeast of my tower, in an area thick with granite outcroppings and natural caves. Nothing official, I told him. But the creek used to bury their dead all over these mountains. Could be an old burial ground that got washed out in the spring floods. Maybe. But these bones... Mike's voice trailed off. They look old, but they're arranged fresh, like someone just put them there. Can you meet us out there tomorrow morning? I said I would. That night, sitting in my tower with a cup of coffee and my logbook, I tried to remember what I knew about creek burial customs. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days back when creek families still lived in these mountains. She said they buried their dead with special ceremonies, placed sacred objects in the graves to help spirits find their way to the next world. She also told stories about things that guarded those graves, bone collectors, she called them. Spirits that would gather up disturbed remains and arrange them properly, then hunt down whoever had disturbed them in the first place. But I never believed those stories. I was a practical man who dealt with real problems. Forest fires, lost hikers, poachers, not ghost stories. The next morning, I hiked down to Devil's Den to meet Deputy Collins and Dr. Sarah Westbrook, an archaeologist from Auburn University who specialized in creek culture. The trail wound through thick stands of longleaf pine and mountain laurel, past granite boulders that looked like sleeping giants. We found the bones in a small clearing where 3 game trails met. Someone had arranged them in 3 perfect circles, each about 6 feet across. The bones were old, yellow-brown with age, but they'd been placed recently. The dirt underneath was still loose, and there were no leaves or debris on them. Creek burial practices, Dr. Westbrook said, kneeling beside one of the circles. These bones are at least 100 years old, maybe more, but someone dug them up and arranged them according to traditional ceremonies. Deputy Collins was taking pictures with his camera. Who would do something like this, and why? I walked around the circles, studying the ground. There were footprints in the soft earth. Human prints, but huge. Size 14 boots at least. The prints led from the bone circles into the woods, heading deeper into the mountains. Probably some nutcase playing with Indian artifacts, Collins said. We'll file a report, but unless someone reports grave robbing, there's not much we can do. But Dr. Westbrook looked worried. These aren't just random bones arranged in circles. This is a proper Creek reburial ceremony. Someone who knows the old ways did this. She pointed to small clay pots placed between the circles. These are burial offerings. Creek shamans used to perform these rituals when graves were disturbed by floods or earthquakes. As we walked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest was too quiet, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering in the trees. Even the insects had gone silent. In 22 years as a ranger, I'd learned to trust those feelings. Animals knew when something was wrong, usually long before humans figured it out. That evening, back in my tower, I radioed the district office in Anniston. This is Tower 7. I need you to check the historical records for Creek burial sites in the Chiaha Wilderness area. The answer came back an hour later. Grit, there are at least dozen documented burial mounds in your sector. Most date back to the 1800s or earlier. Why? I told them about the bone circles. There was a long pause before the voice came back. Be careful up there, Grit. We've had reports of vandalism at several creek sites over the past month. Someone's been digging up graves. The next 3 days were quiet. I made my usual rounds, checking for fire hazards and maintaining two. He trails, but the wrongness I'd felt at Devil's Den seemed to be spreading. Springs that had been flowing the week before went completely dry overnight. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, which should have been a relief, but it felt unnatural, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. On July 19th, I got another radio call from Deputy Collins. Grit, we found another bone site. This one's bigger. The second site was near Pulpit Rock, about 5 miles north of Devil's Den. This time there were 7 circles of bones, arranged in a pattern that Dr. Westbrook said represented the 7 Creek clans. The bones were older than the first batch. Some were so ancient they crumbled when touched. But again, they'd been arranged recently with fresh clay pots and what looked like tobacco offerings. Whoever's doing this knows Creek burial customs better than most Creek people do, Dr. Westbrook said. These rituals haven't been performed in over a century. I studied the footprints around the circles. Same huge boots. But this time I noticed something else. The prints were deep in some places, barely visible in others. Like whoever made them weighed different amounts at different times. Collins, I said, you ever see footprints like these? He crouched down beside me. Jesus, Grit, look at the spacing. Whoever made these has a stride like a giant. That night, I decided to stay up and watch the forest from my tower. I made a pot of strong coffee and settled in with my binoculars. If someone was desecrating Creek graves, I was going to catch them. Around midnight, I saw lights moving through the trees near Pulpit Rock. Not flashlight beams. These lights had a soft, blue-white glow that seemed to float through the forest. I grabbed my radio to call Collins, then stopped. What was I going to tell him? That I was seeing ghost lights? Instead, I climbed down from the tower and followed the old mining road toward Pulpit Rock. I'd grown up in these mountains, knew every trail and game path. I could move through the forest without making a sound. The lights were still visible when I reached the ridge above the bone circles. I crept closer, using the granite boulders for cover. What I saw down there made my blood turn cold. A figure was moving among the bone circles. But it wasn't human. It was huge, at least 9 feet tall, and it moved with a strange, jerky motion, like its joints didn't work right. It wore what looked like traditional Creek burial masks, but they were too big for any human face. In its hands, it carried bones, placing them carefully in new patterns. I watched for 20 minutes, barely breathing. The thing worked in complete silence. arranging bones with the care of someone performing a sacred ritual. When it finished, it stood in the center of the circles and made a sound. Not quite a howl, not quite a chant. It was the loneliest sound I'd ever heard. Then it turned and looked directly at me. Even from 50 yards away, I could see its eyes glowing in the darkness. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it stepped backward into the shadows and disappeared. I ran back to my tower, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. Whatever I'd seen wasn't human. It was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. But I'd seen it with my own eyes. The next morning, I hiked back to Pulpit Rock. The bone circles were still there, but now there were more of them, 13 in total, arranged in a complex pattern that seemed to spiral inward toward a central point. Fresh bones had been added, older ones that looked like they'd been in the ground for centuries. I followed the giant footprints deeper into the forest, past places where no trails existed. The prints led to a natural cave system I'd never seen before, hidden behind a waterfall that had gone dry in the drought. The entrance was large enough for the thing I'd seen, and the smell coming from inside was like old graves and wet earth. I didn't go in. I'm not that brave or that stupid. Instead, I radioed Dr. Westbrook and asked her to meet me at the site. When she saw the new bone arrangements, her face went pale. "This is impossible," she whispered. "These are burial patterns from 7 different Creek clans, representing ceremonies that were only performed by master shamans. No one alive knows these rituals." "What if it's not someone alive?" I asked. She looked at me like I was crazy. "What do you mean?" I told her about the figure I'd seen, the impossible size and movement, the glowing eyes. She listened without interrupting, then sat down on a boulder and put her head in her hands. "Creek legends speak of bonekeepers," she said finally. "Guardian spirits that protect burial sites and perform proper ceremonies for disturbed graves. But they're just stories, Grit. Folklore." "Then explain this." I showed her the footprints, the cave entrance, the perfectly arranged bone circles. She couldn't, and neither could I. That night I stayed in the tower again, watching the forest. The blue lights appeared around 11 o'clock. Moving between different sites throughout the wilderness. Sometimes I counted 3 or 4 separate lights, moving in patterns that seemed almost like a dance. Whatever was out there, it wasn't alone. Over the next week, the situation got worse. Dr. Westbrook found evidence of grave disturbances at 6 different Creek burial sites, all within a 10-mile radius of my tower. Someone had been systematically digging up graves, but instead of stealing artifacts, they were performing reburial ceremonies. "It's like someone is trying to fix damage that was done to these sites," she explained during one of our meetings at the Pulpit Rock site. "These graves were disturbed decades ago, some by flooding, others by construction projects, but now they're being properly restored according to traditional Creek customs." The problem was, the someone doing the restoring wasn't human. I'd seen the bonekeeper 3 more times, always at night. Always performing its strange rituals among the bone circles. Each sighting was clearer than the last. The thing was skeletal thin but impossibly tall, wearing layers of traditional Creek burial masks and clothing that looked like it had been buried for centuries. Its movements were wrong, too fluid in some places, too rigid in others, like it was remembering how to be alive. And it was getting closer to my tower. On July 28th, I found fresh bone circles at the base of Cheaha Mountain, less than a mile from Tower 7. The arrangement was different this time. Instead of separate circles, the bones formed a spiral pattern that led from the forest toward my tower. It was a message, and I understood it perfectly. The thing knew I was watching, and it was coming for me. I called Collins and Dr. Westbrook, but when they arrived, their reaction wasn't what I expected. "Grit," Collins said carefully. "You've been alone up here for too long. The heat, the drought, the isolation, it can play tricks on your mind." "I know what I saw." "You saw something," Dr. Westbrook said. "But giant skeletal guardians? Glowing eyes? Think about it rationally." But I couldn't think about it rationally because rational thinking didn't explain the evidence. The bone circles, the impossible footprints, the fact that animals wouldn't go near any of the sites where the bonekeeper had been working. That night, I made a decision. I was going to confront the thing directly. I loaded my service revolver and filled a backpack with supplies, flashlight, rope, first aid kit, and a bottle of bourbon for courage. Then I hiked down to the cave system behind the dried waterfall. The smell was stronger now, like centuries of death and burial ceremonies. The cave entrance was wider than I remembered, and there were fresh scratches on the rock walls, marks made by claws or fingernails the size of railroad, add spikes. Inside, the cave opened into a natural cathedral, with walls that stretched up into darkness. The floor was covered with bones, thousands of them, arranged in complex patterns that seemed to tell a story. Creek burial masks hung from the walls, and clay pots filled with offerings were arranged around natural stone altars. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a temple. At the center of the chamber, I found what I was looking for. The bonekeeper stood with its back to me, arranging a fresh set of remains on a stone platform. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I'd imagined. Its body was a patchwork of ancient bones held together by dried sinew and will. The Creek burial masks it wore weren't just decoration. They were part of its body, fused to a skull that was too large and shaped wrong. When it turned to face me, I saw the truth in its glowing eye sockets. This wasn't a spirit or a ghost. It was something that had once been human. A Creek shaman who had died protecting these burial sites and refused to stay dead. "You disturbed the peace of the ancestors," it said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. The words came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the cave walls. "I didn't disturb anything," I said, surprised that I could speak at all. "Others did, diggers and builders, treasure hunters and fools. They scattered the bones of my people across the mountains. I gather them. I return them to proper rest." "Then why are you threatening me?" The bonekeeper moved closer, and I could smell the grave dirt on its ancient clothing. "Because you watch. You know. And the living cannot know of the dead's work and live." I understood then. The bonekeeper wasn't evil. It was doing what it thought was right, protecting Creek burial sites and performing proper ceremonies for disturbed graves. But its definition of proper included making sure no living person could interfere with its work. "What if I helped you instead of interfering?" I asked. The creature tilted its massive skull, considering. "How can the living help the dead? I'm a ranger. I protect these mountains. If I knew where all the burial sites were, I could make sure they're protected. No more disturbances. No more need for—" I gestured at the bone-filled chamber. "This." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant drip of water somewhere deep in the cave. Then the bonekeeper nodded slowly. "Show me," it said. What followed was the strangest night of my life. The bonekeeper led me through the mountains, showing me Creek burial sites I never knew existed. Some were obvious, ancient mounds covered with trees and undergrowth. Others were hidden in natural caves or beneath rock formations that looked like ordinary geological features. At each site, the creature told me what had happened. This mound was disturbed by logging operations in the 1920s. That cave was raided by artifact hunters in the 1940s. Another site was flooded when the Army Corps of Engineers built a dam downstream. My people buried their dead with ceremonies that helped spirits find the way to the next world, the bonekeeper explained as we stood beside a partially collapsed burial mound. When the graves are disturbed, the spirits become lost. They wander the mountains, calling for their bones. I gather the bones. I perform the proper rituals. I send the spirits home. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I died in 1838, protecting the last Creek burial ground from soldiers who wanted to move my people west. I refused to leave my ancestors. So I stayed, and death could not take me while my duty remained unfinished." The creature had been wandering these mountains for over a century, gathering disturbed remains and performing reburial ceremonies that most people had forgotten. It was a guardian, but also a prisoner. Trapped between life and death, by a responsibility it couldn't abandon. As dawn approached, we returned to the cave temple, the bone. Keeper showed me detailed maps scratched into the cave walls, marking every creek burial site in the Talladega National Forest. There were dozens of them, including several that were likely to be disturbed by planned development projects. If these sites were officially protected, would that end your work? I asked. If the spirits could rest in peace, I could rest as well. I thought about Dr. Westbrook, about the university's archaeology program, about federal laws protecting Native American burial sites. There might be a way to make this work. But first, I had to survive until morning. The bonekeeper had been honest with me, but I could see the struggle in its glowing eyes. Its nature was to protect creek burial sites by eliminating threats. Even though it had shown me the sites and explained its purpose, I was still a living person who knew too much. You must choose, it said finally. Help protect these sites, or join the spirits you have disturbed by knowing of them. I choose to help. Then prove it. The creature reached into a clay pot and withdrew something that made my blood freeze. A human skull, old but not ancient. Fresh enough that traces of skin still clung to the bone. 3 days ago, a man came to these mountains with machines that dig. He found the sacred mound near Devil's Den and opened it for treasure. I stopped him, but the damage was done. Spirits were released that had been at peace for generations. I realized what it was showing me. The skull belonged to the grave robber, someone who had been digging up creek burial sites for artifacts. The bonekeeper had killed him to protect the graves. If you truly wish to help the ancestors find peace, you must help me perform the final ceremony. The disturbed spirits must be sent home, and the one who disturbed them must pay the price. I looked at the skull, then at the creature holding it, the beard. This was the moment of truth. I could try to run, knowing the bonekeeper would hunt me down. I could try to fight, knowing I couldn't win. Or I could accept that some things were more important than my own life. I thought about my grandmother's stories, about the Creek people who had lived in these mountains for centuries before white settlers arrived. I thought about burial sites that had been disturbed by development, about spirits who couldn't find peace because their remains had been scattered to the wind. What do you need me to do? The bonekeeper's glowing eyes seemed to brighten. It handed me the skull and began arranging bones around the cave's central altar. As it worked, it chanted in what I assumed was the Creek language, words that sounded like wind and water and growing things. Place the skull at the center, it instructed. Speak these words. Find peace in the next world, as your people have found peace. I did as it asked. The moment I spoke the words, the cave filled with a sound like distant thunder. The air grew thick and heavy, and I could see shapes moving in the shadows, translucent figures that looked like Creek warriors and shamans from centuries past. The spirits of the disturbed graves were gathering for the ceremony. What happened next is hard to describe. The bonekeeper began a ritual that seemed to involve the entire cave. Bones rose from the floor and arranged themselves in patterns. The Creek burial masks on the walls began to glow with the same blue-white light I'd seen in the forest. The spirit figures grew more solid, more real, until I could see their faces clearly. They were at peace. One by one, the spirits approached the altar, touched the skull of the man who had disturbed their graves, and faded away. They were going home, moving on to whatever came next. The ceremony continued until dawn, and when it was over, the cave was empty, except for me and the bonekeeper. It is finished, the creature said. The spirits are at rest. What happens now? The bonekeeper looked at me with eyes that were no longer glowing. Now you keep your promise. Protect these sites, and I can finally rest as well. I kept my promise. It took 6 months, but working with Dr. Westbrook and the university's archaeology program, we managed to get most of the Creek burial sites in the Talladega National Forest designated as protected cultural areas. Federal law now prevents any development or excavation without proper archaeological oversight and tribal approval. The official paperwork lists the sites as historically significant Creek cultural locations. There's no mention of bone circles or guardian spirits or shamans who refuse to stay dead. But every ranger in the district knows the real story now, even if they don't all believe it. I transferred to a different tower after that summer. Tower 7 is still operational, but it's staffed by younger rangers who don't ask too many questions about the quiet zones where wildlife won't go, and springs sometimes run dry overnight. The bone circles are gone now. When I went back to check on the sites a year later, nature had reclaimed them. Grass grew where the bones had been arranged, and the places that had felt wrong were peaceful again. Even the cave temple behind the dried waterfall was empty, filled with nothing but ordinary darkness and the smell of old stone. I never saw the bonekeeper again after that night in the cave, but sometimes when I'm working late shifts in my new tower, I see blue lights moving through distant mountains. Not urgent like they used to be, but slow and peaceful, like someone walking through a garden tending to flowers. Dr. Westbrook published papers about the creek burial sites, describing them as remarkably well-preserved examples of traditional Native American funeral customs. She never mentioned how we found them or why they needed to be preserved. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share with people who don't understand. The mountains are quiet now. Animals have returned to areas where they wouldn't go before. The springs run clean and steady, even during drought years. Creek burial sites that had been disturbed for decades are finally at peace. But I've learned something that most people don't want to know. The dead don't always stay dead, especially when they have work left to finish, and sometimes the living have to help them finish it. There are other protected areas in Alabama now, places where development has been mysteriously delayed or canceled due to environmental concerns or historical significance. I helped establish some of them, working with Dr. Westbrook and other archaeologists to identify sites that needed protection. Not all of them were creek burial grounds. Some were Cherokee sites in the northern part of the state. Others belonged to tribes whose names have been lost to history. But they all had one thing in common. They were places where the dead weren't resting peacefully, and something needed to be done about it. The work continues. There are still burial sites being disturbed by development, still spirits that need help finding their way home, still guardians doing whatever it takes to protect their people's remains. But now there are living people helping too. Rangers and archaeologists and tribal representatives who understand that some places are too sacred to disturb. My grandmother used to say that the land remembers everything that happens on it. She was right. And sometimes, when the land remembers something too painful to forget, it sends guardians to make sure the living remember too. I'm 68 years old now, retired from the Forest Service, but still living in the mountains I've protected for over 40 years. Sometimes young rangers come to visit, asking for advice about strange things they've seen in the wilderness. Lights that move through the forest at night, areas where animals won't go, places that feel wrong for no reason anyone can explain. I listen to their stories, and when I think they're ready to hear the truth, I tell them about the bonekeeper and the creek burial sites and the responsibility that comes with protecting sacred places. Some of them believe me. Others think I'm just an old man telling ghost stories. But they all remember what I tell them. If you find bones arranged in circles in the forest, don't disturb them. If you see blue lights moving through the trees at night, don't follow them. And if you discover burial sites that have been damaged or disturbed, call the archaeology department at Auburn University immediately, because the dead are always watching, and some of them are still working to protect what matters most. The mountains are peaceful now, but peace requires constant vigilance. That's a lesson I learned from a 9-foot-tall Creek shaman who refused to let death stop him from doing his job. And it's a lesson I'll never forget. My name is Chester Mullins, but everybody calls me Cave. Been working as a ranger in the Ozark National Forest for 20 years now, and I've seen just about everything these Arkansas mountains can throw at you. Lost hikers, flash floods, the occasional black bear getting too friendly with campers. But what happened in October of 1968 changed everything I thought I knew about what lives beneath our feet. I got my nickname honest. Spent most of my career mapping cave systems along the Buffalo River. More than 200 caves I've charted, from little limestone holes barely big enough to crawl through to massive chambers that could hold a cathedral. The Ozarks are like Swiss cheese underground, riddled with passages carved out over millions of years by water and time. That morning started like any other. October frost was just beginning to bite, and the leaves were turning those deep reds and golds that make tourists drive up from Little Rock with their cameras. I was sitting in my ranger station, a little log cabin about 5 miles upstream from Rush, Arkansas, when the call came in. "Cave, we got a problem up at Hemmed-In Hollow," said Martha, our dispatcher. Her voice crackled through the radio with that particular tone that meant real trouble. I knew the place well. Hemmed-In Hollow Falls is the tallest waterfall between the Rockies and the Appalachians. 200 feet of water dropping straight down into a pool so deep nobody's ever found the bottom. Popular spot for experienced hikers, but dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. "What kind of problem?" I asked, pulling on my jacket. 3 college kids went missing yesterday. Park Service found their campsite this morning, but no sign of them. Just gone. I grabbed my gear. Rope, flashlight, first aid kit, my old carbide headlamp for serious cave work. 20 years of experience had taught me that. When people disappear in the Ozarks, they usually end up underground. These mountains are full of hidden passages and sudden drop-offs that can swallow a person whole. The drive up to Hemmed-In Hollow took 40 minutes on winding dirt roads. My truck bounced and rattled over rocks and roots, past stands of oak and hickory that grew so thick they blocked out most of the sky. The deeper you go into the Ozarks, the more you feel like you're traveling back in time. I found the campsite easily enough. 3 backpacks, a cold fire pit, and a tent still zipped up tight. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing torn or scattered. It was like the 3 kids had just walked away from their camp and vanished into thin air. But I noticed something odd right away. The ground around the campsite was covered with a thin layer of limestone dust, like someone had been grinding up rock with machinery. I'd never seen anything like it in 20 years of ranger work. I started a careful search pattern, moving in wider and wider circles around the camp. About 50 yards north, near the base of the bluff, I found something that made my skin crawl. There was a hole in the ground, maybe 3 feet across, that definitely hadn't been there the last time I'd patrolled this area. The hole was perfectly round, cut through solid limestone like it had been bored out with some kind of drill. But no drill bit in the world could cut stone that smooth. The edges were polished, almost glass-like, and when I dropped a rock down the opening, I counted to 10 before I heard it hit bottom. That's when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere deep underground. A low, rhythmic tapping, like someone hammering metal against stone. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It had a pattern to it, almost like Morse code, but not quite. I called down into the hole. "Hello, anyone down there?" The tapping stopped him, immediately. For about 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Then it started again. But different this time. Faster, more urgent. And somehow, I got the feeling it was answering me. Standing there at the edge of that impossible hole, with that weird tapping echoing up from the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in all my years in these mountains. Fear. Real, gut-deep fear that made my hands shake and my mouth go dry. I've always been a practical man. Caves are geology, nothing more. Water dissolves limestone, creates caverns. End of story. Never believed in hollow earth theories or any of that nonsense. But looking down into that perfect circular opening, listening to that rhythmic tapping that sounded almost like communication, I started to wonder if maybe there were things about these mountains I didn't understand. The radio crackled on my belt. Martha's voice. "Cave, you find anything up there?" I keyed the microphone, still staring down into the hole. "Maybe. I'm going to need some backup up here, and tell the sheriff to bring climbing gear, lots of it." "How bad is it?" I looked around at the empty campsite, the limestone dust, and that perfectly round hole that shouldn't exist. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I got a feeling this is just the beginning." Sheriff Jim Hawkins arrived 2 hours later with 3 deputies and enough rope to reach the center of the earth. Jim was a good man, steady and smart, but he'd never done much cave work. Most folks around Rush avoided the underground. Too many stories of people going down and never coming back up. "What do you think happened to them kids?" Jim asked, peering down into the hole with a flashlight. "Hard to say," I replied, strapping on my climbing harness. "But this hole wasn't here last week when I did my patrol. Something made it, and made it recent." The tapping had stopped completely once the other men arrived, like whatever was down there was waiting and listening. I'd been hearing stories about these mountains my whole life, old Cherokee tales about things that lived in the deep caves, settlers who claimed to hear drumming from underground. Always figured it was just folklore. But standing there getting ready to rappel into that perfectly round hole, those stories didn't seem so crazy anymore. "You sure you want to go down there alone?" Deputy Mike Torres asked. He was young, maybe 25, but he had good instincts. "I've been in more caves than anyone in Arkansas," I said, testing my gear one more time. "If those kids are down there, they're going to need someone who knows what he's doing." The descent was unlike anything I'd experienced in 20 years of cave work. The walls of the shaft were smooth as glass, without the usual rough limestone formations you'd expect. About 30 feet down, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There were tool marks in the stone. Not from any machine I'd ever seen, but definitely artificial. Parallel grooves spiraled down the walls, like something with claws had carved its way up from the bottom. The grooves were too regular to be natural, too precise to be accidental. At 60 feet, my headlamp beam caught something that made my heart skip. Carved into the wall was a symbol, a circle with lines radiating out from the center, like a sun or a star. Below it were smaller markings, almost like writing, but not in any alphabet I recognized. I called up to the surface. "Jim, you need to see this. These walls are covered with some kind of markings." "What kind of markings?" "I don't know, but they're old. Real old." The shaft opened up at about 80 feet into a horizontal passage that stretched away into darkness. The air was different down here, thick and humid, with a mineral smell that reminded me of deep caves. But there was something else, too, a musky odor like wet fur and old bones. I found the first piece of evidence about 20 yards into the passage. A hiking boot, size 10 band, still laced up tight. No foot inside it, no blood, just an empty boot sitting in the middle of the tunnel like someone had stepped right out of it. The passage curved to the left, following what looked like a natural limestone formation. But the more I studied it, the more I realized it wasn't natural at all. The walls were too smooth, the ceiling too uniform. This tunnel had been carved out, enlarged and shaped by something with tools and intelligence. That's when I heard the breathing. It was coming from somewhere ahead of me, slow and deep, like something large resting in the darkness. I switched off my light and listened. The sound was rhythmic, peaceful almost, like whatever was making it was asleep. I crept forward, feeling my way along the wall with one hand. After about 30 feet, my fingers touched something that made me freeze. The wall was warm. Not just warm, hot, like there was a furnace burning on the other side of the stone. I'd been in thousands of caves, and they're always cold, 54 degrees year-round, no matter what the weather is like above ground. But this rock was so hot I had to pull my hand away. I switched my light back on and almost screamed. The passage opened into a huge chamber, bigger than anything I'd ever seen underground. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above my head, and the far walls were lost in shadow. But it wasn't the size that stopped my heart. It was what was inside. Scattered across the chamber floor were dozens of objects, backpacks, hiking boots, clothes, camping gear. Some of it looked recent, but other items were old, really old. I saw a cavalry sword with a tarnished brass guard, a flintlock rifle with a cracked stock, even what looked like pieces of Spanish armor. This wasn't just about 3 missing college kids. People had been disappearing in these mountains for centuries. I was so focused on the artifacts that I almost missed the movement in the shadows. Something large shifted near the far wall, and that deep breathing I'd been hearing stopped abruptly. My headlamp beam swept across the chamber, and for just a second, I caught a glimpse of something that my mind couldn't quite process. tall, maybe 7 feet, covered in what looked like gray fur or skin. It was hunched over, examining something in its hands, but when my light hit it, the thing turned and looked directly at me. The eyes were the worst part. Not animal eyes, but not quite human either. Intelligent, curious, and completely alien. We stared at each other for maybe 3 seconds, and in that moment, I understood that I was looking at something that had been living under these mountains for longer than any human had walked on top of them. Then it moved. I've never seen anything that big move that fast. It disappeared into the shadows like smoke, and suddenly I was alone in a chamber full of evidence that people had been vanishing in the Ozarks for hundreds of years. My radio crackled with Jim's voice. "Cave, you okay down there? You've been quiet for 10 minutes. I keyed the microphone with shaking hands. "Jim, I need you to pull me up. Right now. Did you find the kids?" I looked around at the scattered belongings, the impossible hot walls, and the shadows where something inhuman had been watching me. "No," I said. "But I found something else. Something we're going to need help with." The climb back to the surface felt like it took forever. With every foot of rope, I expected to feel claws grab my legs and drag me back down into that chamber of lost things. But I made it to the top where Jim and his deputies were waiting with worried faces. "What did you see down there?" Jim asked. I looked back at the hole, thinking about those intelligent eyes and the centuries of missing people. "We need to call Little Rock," I said. "Get some experts up here, archaeologists, maybe some folks from the university." "That bad?" I thought about the thing in the chamber, the way it had looked at me with such curiosity, like I was the strange creature in its world. "Jim," I said, "I think we're dealing with something that's been living under these mountains since before the Cherokee got here. Maybe before any humans got here." "What do you mean?" I coiled up my rope and started walking back toward the trucks. "I mean, those 3 kids didn't just get lost. They got taken. And if we don't figure out what's down there real quick, they won't be the last ones." The experts arrived from the University of Arkansas 3 days later. Dr. Sarah Chen, an archaeologist, and Dr. Robert Vance, a geologist who specialized in karst formations. They took one look at the hole and the symbols I'd sketched from the walls and got real excited real fast. "These markings are unlike anything in the archaeological record," Dr. Chen said, studying my drawings with a magnifying glass. "If they're authentic, they could rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian Arkansas." "They're authentic," I said, "carved right into the limestone, probably hundreds of years old." Dr. Vance was more interested in the hole itself. "This shaft shows signs of artificial excavation, but the techniques are completely unknown. No tool marks match any technology from the historical period." What they didn't know, what I hadn't told them, was about the creature I'd seen in the chamber. Something told me to keep that information to myself until I understood more about what we were dealing with. We set up a proper expedition camp at the site, more equipment than I'd ever seen for cave exploration, cameras, measuring devices, air quality monitors, even a small generator to power floodlights. The sheriff stationed a deputy at the hole 24 hours a day after 2 more hikers went missing from a campground 10 miles downstream. The tapping started again on the second night. I was in my tent trying to get some sleep when that rhythmic sound echoed up from the shaft. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it was different. More complex, with longer patterns and shorter ones mixed together. There. Dr. Chen was awake too. "Do you hear that?" she whispered from her tent. "Yeah, it's been happening on and off since we found this place. It sounds almost like communication," I finished. We sat in the dark listening to the tapping for about 20 minutes. The patterns kept changing, getting more elaborate, like whatever was down there was trying different approaches to get a response from us. That's when Deputy Torres came running over from his guard post. "Mr. Mullins, you need to see this. Something's happening at the hole." We followed him back to the shaft, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The perfectly round opening was glowing, not bright, but with a soft, greenish light that seemed to come from deep underground. "What could cause that?" Dr. Vance asked, setting up his instruments. Bioluminescence, maybe, Dr. Chen suggested. Some kind of fungus or bacteria. But I had a different theory. In all my years exploring caves, I'd learned that the deep places had their own rules. And right now, something down there was trying to communicate with us. The glow pulsed in rhythm with the tapping. Light, tap, 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 light, tap, tap, tap. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "We need to go down there," Dr. Chen said. "Document whatever's causing this phenomenon." "Not at night," I said. "Cave work is dangerous enough in daylight. We wait until morning." But morning brought new problems. When I got up at sunrise, Deputy Torres was gone. His post was abandoned, his radio lying on the ground beside the hole. The opening wasn't glowing anymore, but there was fresh limestone dust scattered around the edges. Sheriff Hawkins arrived with backup within an hour. "That's 3 of my men missing now," he said grimly. "First the college kids, then Torres. Something's hunting people in these mountains." "Not hunting," I said, studying the dust. "Pattern. Collecting. What's the difference?" I pointed to the scattered limestone particles. "Hunters kill their prey. This looks more like research. Whatever's down there is studying us, trying to understand what we are." Dr. Vance's equipment was picking up strange readings, too. "The seismic activity is off the charts," he said, checking his instruments. "There's massive movement underground, like someone's excavating new tunnels." "How big?" I asked. "Miles of them. The entire mountain seems to be honeycombed with passages we never knew existed." That afternoon, we made a discovery that changed everything. Dr. Chen was analyzing rock samples from the shaft when she found something embedded in the limestone, a piece of worked metal, corroded but clearly artificial. "This is gold," she said, holding up a small ornament shaped like a spiral. "Pre-Columbian gold work, but the style doesn't match any known Native American culture." "How old?" Sheriff Hawkins asked. "At least 1,000 years, maybe more." I took the ornament and examined it closely. The spiral pattern matched some of the symbols I'd seen carved in the shaft walls. "There's something else," I said. "This wasn't dropped or lost. It was placed in that rock sample deliberately, like someone wanted us to find it." "What do you mean?" "I mean whatever's down there has been watching us, learning about us for a long time. And now it's trying to tell us something." The tapping started again that evening, but now we were ready. Dr. Chen had set up recording equipment, and Dr. Vance was monitoring for any changes in the underground activity. The patterns were more complex than ever, almost like a conversation between multiple sources. "There's at least 3 different rhythm signatures," Dr. Chen said, studying the readouts. "Whatever's down there, there's more than one of them." The glow came back too, stronger this time. Green light pulsed up from the depths, creating shifting patterns on the trees around our camp. It was hypnotic, beautiful in a way that made you want to get closer. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from underground, echoing up the shaft. Human voices, terrified and desperate. The missing college kids, Deputy Torres, maybe others we didn't even know about. "They're alive," Sheriff Hawkins said, grabbing his climbing gear. "We're going down there right now." "Wait," I said. "This could be a trap. Those screams, they might not be what they seem." But it was too late. The sheriff was already rappelling into the hole, and Dr. Vance was following him. Dr. Chen and I had no choice but to go after them. The descent was different this time. The walls were covered with new symbols, fresh carvings that hadn't been there before. The tapping got louder as we went deeper, coming from all directions now, like we were surrounded. At the bottom, the horizontal passage had changed. New tunnels branched off in directions that hadn't existed 3 days ago. The limestone dust was everywhere, thick as snow, and the air smelled strongly of that musky, animal odor. We found Sheriff Hawkins about 50 yards down the main passage. He was standing perfectly still, staring at something in the shadows ahead of us. "Jim," I called softly. "You okay?" He turned around, and I saw that his eyes were different. Still human, but with a strange, distant quality, like he was sleepwalking. "They're not what we thought," he said in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. "They've been here so long, Cave, so much longer than us." "Who's been here?" "The ones who built all this. They're not gone. They never left. That's when the lights went out. All of them at once. Our headlamps, flashlights, even Dr. Vance's electronic equipment. We were plunged into absolute darkness deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. And in that darkness, something moved toward us. The darkness was complete, but not silent. I could hear breathing all around us. Not human surveyors, but something deeper, more controlled. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a sound like whispered conversation in a language I'd never heard before. "Stay together," I whispered, reaching out to find Dr. Chen's hand. "Don't move unless I tell you to." My 20 years of cave experience had taught me that panic kills people underground faster than any natural hazard. Even in complete darkness, I could navigate by sound and air currents. But this wasn't any ordinary cave situation. A light appeared ahead of us, not electric, but that same green glow we'd seen from the surface. It was moving, carried by something tall that walked upright but with a strange, flowing gait. Behind it came more lights, a whole procession moving through the passages. "My God," Dr. Chen whispered. "What are they?" As the lights got closer, I could make out shapes. Humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with elongated limbs and that gray, fur-like covering I'd glimpsed before. Their faces were the most disturbing part. Almost human features, but stretched and modified by thousands of years of underground evolution. The one in front stopped about 10 feet away from us and did something I never expected. It spoke. Not in English, but in a voice that somehow bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my mind. Images flooded my consciousness. The history of these mountains, stretching back millions of years. I saw the truth of what lived beneath the Ozarks. They called themselves the Hollow People, and they'd been here since before humans walked upright. When the first Native Americans arrived, the Hollow People retreated deeper underground, watching and learning. They'd witnessed every wave of human settlement: Spanish explorers, French trappers, Cherokee tribes, American settlers. For centuries, they'd taken people. Not out of malice, but out of curiosity. Humans were strange to them, surface dwellers who lived brief lives under the burning sky. They collected us the way we might collect interesting insects, studying our tools, our clothes, our behaviors. The MIS. Icing college kids were alive, along with Deputy Torres and dozens of others taken over the years. They lived in deeper chambers, cared for like valuable specimens in some vast underground museum of human civilization. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, somehow knowing the creature would understand. The answer came as more images. The Hollow People were dying. Their ancient civilization was ending, their numbers dwindling with each generation. The deep places were becoming unstable, centuries of mining and excavation causing cave-ins and flooding. They needed something from us. Not to take more humans, but to make contact, to find a way for both species to survive. Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward, and I realized he wasn't under their control. He was translating, serving as a bridge between human and Hollow People communication. "They want to make a deal, Cave," he said in his own voice. "They'll return everyone they've taken, stop the disappearances, if we help them find new places to live. Deeper caves, places where humans don't go. And if we refuse?" The images that flooded my mind then were darker. The Hollow People could collapse every cave system in Arkansas if they wanted to. They could make the Buffalo River disappear underground, cause sinkholes that would swallow entire towns. They'd been holding back for centuries, but desperation was making them consider more drastic measures. "They're not threatening us," Sheriff Hawkins said. "They're explaining what might happen if they have to keep moving deeper. The whole mountain is riddled with their tunnels. If those collapse..." I understood. We were standing on top of a vast underground civilization that was literally holding up the surface world. If the Hollow People were forced to abandon their territory, the geological consequences would be catastrophic. "What do you need from me?" I asked the creature, and the answer came in the form of a map appearing in my mind with perfect clarity. Every cave system in Arkansas, Missouri, and Tennessee, the connected passages, the deep chambers, the places where hollow people could relocate without interfering with human activity. They needed a guide, someone who knew the underground territory well enough to help them find new homes. Someone who could serve as a liaison between their civilization and ours. "You want me to be your scout," I said. The creature nodded, a surprisingly human gesture. But there was more. They wanted me to live with them, to learn their ways while teaching them about the surface world. It would mean leaving behind everything I knew, spending the rest of my life in the deep places. I looked at my companions, Dr. Chen staring in amazement at the impossible scene, Dr. Vance frantically taking notes, Sheriff Hawkins waiting calmly for my decision. Above us, the surface world continued its normal routine, unaware that two species were negotiating the future beneath their feet. "If I do this," I said, "everyone they've taken goes free. No more disappearances. And you find ways to stabilize the tunnels so the surface doesn't collapse." The creature communicated agreement, along with something else. Gratitude. These beings had been alone for so long, hiding from a surface world that would never understand them. The idea of peaceful contact, of cooperation instead of hiding, was as important to them as their survival. "I need to see them first," I said. "The people you've taken. I need to know they're really okay." The procession began moving deeper into the mountain, and we followed. The passages opened into chambers I couldn't have imagined. Vast spaces carved from living rock, lit by bioluminescent formations that had been cultivated over thousands of years. The architecture was organic, flowing, like the inside of some enormous creature. And there, in a chamber that looked like a cross between a library and a greenhouse, were the missing people. Deputy Torres looked up as we entered, his face breaking into a grin. "Cave, man, am I glad to see you. These folks have been taking real good care of us, but I was starting to worry nobody would figure out where we went." The 3 college kids were there too, along with about 20 other people of various ages. They all looked healthy, well-fed, and remarkably calm for people who'd been kidnapped by underground creatures. "They don't hurt anyone," one of the college kids explained. "They're just curious. They ask questions about the surface world, trade food and shelter for information. It's like being guests in the strangest museum ever built." I looked around at the impossible collection. Artifacts from every period of human history in Arkansas, carefully preserved and displayed. Spanish armor next to Cherokee pottery. Civil War uniforms alongside modern camping gear. The Hollow people had been documenting human civilization for centuries. "So what's it going to be, Cave?" Sheriff Hawkins asked. "You going to help them?" I thought about my 20 years as a ranger, all the caves I'd mapped, all the mysteries I'd never solved. Here was the biggest mystery of all, and the solution required a sacrifice I'd never imagined making. But looking at these ancient beings, seeing the hope in their alien faces, understanding the delicate balance that kept both our species alive, I knew there was really only one choice. "I'll do it," I said. "But we do this right. Official contact, government involvement, scientists from the university. No more hiding, no more taking people. We figure out how to share these mountains." The creature that had first spoken to me approached and extended something that might have been a hand. When I took it, I felt a connection deeper than words. The promise of partnership between surface and depth, between 2 species that had shared the same territory for thousands of years without knowing it. That was 6 months ago. I'm writing this from my new office, a chamber about 300 feet below Buffalo National River, connected to the surface by a proper elevator shaft. The Hollow people excavated in 2 weeks. Above ground, there's now a joint research station staffed by scientists from 3 universities and representatives from both the state and federal government. The missing people were all returned safely, though most of them chose to stay involved with the project. Deputy Torres became the official liaison between the sheriff's department and our underground friends. The 3 college kids changed their majors to archaeology and are now writing their dissertations on Hollow people culture. Dr. Chen was right. The discovery did rewrite our understanding of Arkansas history. Carbon dating of artifacts in the deeper chambers proved continuous habitation going back over 10,000 years. The Hollow people aren't just another human subspecies. They're a completely separate evolutionary branch that learned to live in harmony with the underground world. The cooperation has been remarkable. The Hollow people's ability to work stone has revolutionized our understanding of geological engineering. They've shown us how to reinforce unstable cave systems, how to predict and prevent sinkholes, how to tap into underground water sources without damaging the ecosystem. In return, we've helped them relocate about half their population to deeper, more stable cave systems in the Ouachita Mountains. The other half chose to stay in the Ozarks, working with our research teams to document their culture and history. I spend most of my time underground now, though I still make trips to the surface. The Hollow people gave me a modified version of their echolocation ability. Not as good as theirs, but enough to navigate the deep passages without lights. It's amazing how different the world looks when you can perceive it through sound instead of sight. There have been challenges, of course. Some government officials wanted to classify the whole disc, ovary, keep it secret from the public. A few religious groups declared the Hollow people demons or angels, depending on their theology. The scientific community is still arguing about the evolutionary implications. But overall, the integration has been smoother than anyone expected. The Hollow people are remarkably adaptable, and their perspective on time makes them patient with human bureaucracy. They've been watching us for centuries. They understand our nature better than we understand theirs. The tapping I heard that first day, it was their equivalent of knocking on the door. They'd been trying to make contact for decades, but never found the right person to communicate with. My 20 years of cave experience, my familiarity with the underground world made me a suitable translator between our species. There are still mysteries down here, passages that extend for miles in directions we haven't explored, chambers sealed off by cave-ins that happened centuries ago. The Hollow people hint at other settlements, other branches of their species living in cave systems across the continent. Sometimes late at night in the deep chambers, I hear that rhythmic tapping echoing from passages we haven't mapped yet. It's not threatening anymore. It's welcoming. A sound that says the underground world is vast and full of wonders we're only beginning to understand. I still call myself a ranger, though my territory has expanded considerably. Instead of patrolling a few hundred square miles of surface forest, I'm now responsible for thousands of miles of underground passages. The pay is better, too. The Hollow people have a surprising amount of gold and precious stones they're willing to trade for surface goods. My only regret is that it took so long to make contact. How many people over the centuries disappeared into these mountains, not because they encountered something evil, but because they stumbled into a first contact situation neither species was prepared for. How much could we have learned if we'd started this cooperation 100 years ago? But that's in the past now. What matters is the future. Two species working together, sharing knowledge and territory, proving that cooperation is possible even between beings as different as surface dwellers and Hollow people. The Arkansas Ozarks are still mysterious, still full of secrets. But now I know that some of those secrets have been waiting patiently in the dark for someone willing to listen. The mountains are alive with more than just wildlife and forests. They're home to an ancient civilization that's finally ready to step out of the shadows. And sometimes, if you know where to listen, you can still hear that rhythmic tapping echoing through the limestone passages. Not a warning or a threat, but an invitation. The underground world is vast and welcoming, full of wonders that surface dwellers are only beginning to imagine. My name is Chester Mullins, and I'm still called Cave. But now it means something different. I'm not just someone who explores caves. I'm someone who lives in them, who's learned that the boundary between surface and depth is just another line humans drew on a map. The real world is much bigger than we ever imagined, and it's been waiting beneath our feet all along. My name is Jeremiah Talmadge, but everyone calls me Scout. I've been a park ranger for 16 years now, working the Holly Springs National Forest down in Mississippi. December of 1974 was when everything changed for me. when I learned that some boundaries can't be measured with any tool man ever made. I'm a land surveyor by training, got my civil engineering degree back in '58 before I took this ranger job. Property disputes are my specialty. I've settled more boundary arguments than I care to count. Farmers claiming creek beds moved, developers swearing their deed descriptions were right when they clearly weren't. I always said the same thing. Property lines are just legal boundaries, folks. Nothing mystical about them. That December, we got hit with the worst ice storm in 20 years. Trees down everywhere. Power lines snapped like guitar strings. The forest looked like a crystal palace. Everything coated in 2 inches of solid ice. Beautiful, but dangerous as hell. I was camped out at the Chihuahua Lake Station checking on damage reports. The radio crackled with calls from all over. Hikers stranded, cabins without heat, roads impassable. But there was one call that caught my attention. A surveyor from Memphis, working a property dispute right on the Tennessee-Mississippi border, hadn't checked in for 3 days. His name's Bill Crawford, Deputy Morris told me over the radio. Was supposed to finish up Tuesday and head back home. Wife's worried sick. I knew the area he was talking about. Rough country up on the ridge, where the forest gets thick and the old Cherokee trails still cut through like scars. It's disputed land. Has been for over a century. The state boundary markers up there never seem to stay put. Every few years, someone would find them moved, sometimes by hundreds of yards. I'll head up there first thing tomorrow, I told Morris. Storms. Breaking, anyway. That night, sitting by my wood stove, I pulled out the old survey maps. The disputed area was marked in red ink, about 40 acres that both states claimed. The original Cherokee land grant from 1838 was confusing, written in flowery legal language that described boundaries using trees and rocks that didn't exist anymore. I traced the property lines with my finger. Something felt wrong about the whole thing, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The numbers didn't add up quite right. The angles were off by just a few degrees, but in surveying, a few degrees can mean hundreds of feet over distance. Outside, I heard something that made me look up from the maps. It sounded like someone walking around my cabin, boots crunching on the icy ground, slow, deliberate steps, like someone pacing off distances. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The ice made everything sparkle in the beam, but I didn't see anyone. The footprints in the snow led from the tree line right up to my cabin, then stopped at the porch steps, but there were no prints leading away. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" Nothing but wind through the ice-covered trees, making them chime like church bells. I followed the prints back toward the forest. They were clear as day in the frozen ground. Work boots, size 10 or 11. But 20 feet from the cabin, they just ended. Like whoever made them had stepped off the earth. Back inside, I spread the maps out again. My coffee had gone cold, and the fire was burning low. I was about to fold everything up when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the red boundary lines on the map had moved. I was sure it had been running north-south along the ridge when I first looked at it. Now it angled southeast, cutting through a completely different section of forest. I rubbed my eyes, figured the strain of reading old documents was getting to me, but when I looked again, the line was still in the wrong place. I pulled out my backup maps, the ones I kept in the filing cabinet. Same thing. The boundary line cut southeast. That's when I heard the footsteps again, circling the cabin. This time, they stopped right outside my window. I was up at dawn, loading my gear into the truck. The ice was already starting to melt, dripping from the trees like rain. The disputed boundary area was about 12 miles up the ridge, accessible only by an old logging road that probably hadn't seen maintenance in years. The drive took 2 hours, my truck sliding and fighting for grip on the icy ruts. When I finally reached the area where Crawford had been working, I found his surveying equipment scattered around a small clearing. Transit level knocked over, measuring chain tangled in the brush. His truck was there too, keys still in the ignition. "Bill?" I called out. "Bill Crawford?" No answer except the drip of melting ice. I found his field notebook lying open near a metal boundary marker. The pages were soaked through, but I could still read his last entry. Deck 16, 3:17 p.m. Markers keep moving overnight. This isn't possible. GPS readings don't match. Something wrong with the magnetic readings. Compass spinning like a top. I pulled out my own compass. The needle swung wildly, never settling on any direction. I'd seen magnetic anomalies before. Iron deposits in the ground could throw off instruments. But this was different. The needle didn't just point wrong, it moved in slow circles like it was confused. Following Crawford's measuring chain, I found what he'd been working on. 3 boundary markers, heavy iron posts driven deep into the ground. According to the map, they should have formed a straight line running due north. Instead, they formed a triangle. I checked my GPS unit. According to the satellite, I was standing about a quarter-mile west of where the clearing should be. I double-checked the reading, reset the unit, checked it again. Same result. What the hell? I muttered. That's when I saw the footprints. Fresh ones, pressed into the soft earth around the markers. But these weren't Crawford's boot prints. They were bare feet, with strange toe impressions that looked almost like claws. And they were arranged in a pattern around each marker, like someone had been dancing. I started taking photographs, documenting everything. Through the camera viewfinder, I noticed something else. In the trees beyond the markers, there were blazes cut into the bark. Old ones, almost grown over. But they weren't the kind of blazes we used for trail marking. These were symbols, circles and lines that looked like some kind of writing. Following the blazes deeper into the woods, I found more boundary markers. Dozens of them, stretching through the forest in patterns that made no sense. Some were the standard iron posts used by surveyors. Others were older, stone cairns and carved wooden stakes that looked like they'd been there for generations. My radio crackled with static. I tried to call back to base, but couldn't get through. The GPS was still giving me impossible readings, showing my location jumping around like I was teleporting. That's when I found Crawford. He was sitting against a large oak tree about 50 yards from the clearing, looking peaceful as could be. For a moment I thought he was just resting. Then I got closer and saw his eyes were wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. His surveying notebook was clutched in his hands, filled with page after page of the same words written over and over. Wrong boundaries, wrong boundaries, wrong boundaries. I checked for a pulse even though I knew there wouldn't be one. His skin was cold as the morning air, but there wasn't a mark on him. No injury, no sign of struggle. He'd just stopped. That's when I heard the sound that's haunted me ever since. From somewhere in the trees came the distinct noise of a measuring chain being dragged across the ground. The metal links clinked together in a steady rhythm, like someone pacing off distances. I spun around looking for the source. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees. Then I saw him, a figure moving between the trees, maybe 100 yards away. Tall, wearing what looked like old-fashioned surveying clothes. Canvas pants, suspenders, a wide-brimmed hat. He was dragging a long chain behind him, stopping every few steps to drive stakes into the ground. "Hey!" I shouted. "Hey, you there?" The figure looked up at me, and even from that distance I could see his face wasn't right. It was too pale, too thin, with dark holes where his eyes should be. He raised one hand in what might have been a greeting, then turned and walked behind a large pine tree. I ran toward the spot, crashing through the underbrush. When I got there, nobody was around. No footprints, no stakes, no sign anyone had been there at all. But carved into the pine tree, still bleeding fresh sap, were those same strange symbols I'd seen on the other blazes. My hands shaking, I pulled out my camera again. But when I looked through the viewfinder, the symbols weren't there. The tree bark was smooth and unmarked. I lowered the camera. The symbols were back. That's when I understood that something was very wrong with this place. Something that couldn't be measured or mapped or explained with any tools I knew how to use. I should have left right then. Should have marked Crawford's location, hiked back to my truck, and called for backup. Instead, I did what 16 years of ranger training had taught me to do. I investigated. The measuring chain sounds followed me as I worked my way through the forest, always just out of sight. Every time I thought I'd pinpointed the source, it would shift to another direction. Sometimes it seemed to come from underground, like someone was surveying in tunnels beneath my feet. I started finding more evidence of the phantom surveyor's work. Property stakes, driven into impossible places, 20 feet up in trees, balanced on top of boulders, stuck right through the middle of streams. Each one was carved with those strange symbols, and each one made my compass spin even faster. The GPS was completely useless now, showing my location as everywhere and nowhere at once. One reading put me in Tennessee. The next showed me a mile underground. Then it claimed I was standing in the middle of Chewalla Lake. But it was the maps that really scared me. I'd spread them out on a fallen log to double-check my position, and I watched the red boundary lines move while I was looking at them. Not all at once, but slowly, like ink bleeding across wet paper. The disputed 40 acres was growing, spreading across the forest like a stain. I tried the radio again. This time I got through, but the voice that answered wasn't anyone I recognized. Holly Springs Base, this is Scout. I need backup at the boundary dispute site. Found Crawford, but there's something seriously wrong up here. The voice that crackled back was speaking in a language I didn't understand. Cherokee, maybe, or some other tribal tongue. It sounded angry, urgent, like someone giving orders. Base, do you copy? This is Ranger Talmadge requesting immediate assistance. More Cherokee words, getting louder now. Then the radio went dead. I was packing up my gear when I heard footsteps behind me. Not the measuring chain this time. Actual footsteps, moving through the leaves. I turned around and saw 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. They were dressed like Crawford, surveying clothes from maybe 50 or 60 years ago. Old-fashioned transits hung from their shoulders, and they carried wooden stakes instead of the metal markers we use now. But their faces were wrong, just like the first one I'd seen. Too pale, too gaunt, with dark, empty sockets where their eyes shut. Udby. The one in the middle stepped forward and spoke in that same Cherokee language I'd heard on the radio. His voice had an echo to it, like he was talking from the bottom of a deep, "Well, I don't understand," I said, backing toward my gear. "What do you want?" He pointed at the boundary markers Crawford had been working on, then at me. The meaning was clear enough. I was trespassing on their territory. "This is public land," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "National forest. Those boundaries were settled by the federal government." The phantom surveyor shook his head slowly. He pulled out an old leather case and removed what looked like a hand-drawn map. Even from 20 feet away, I could see it was covered with those strange symbols, connected by lines that formed patterns across the paper. He held up the map, pointing at various spots, then gestured toward the forest around us. He was showing me boundaries, not the legal property lines I knew, but something older, something that had been here long before white settlers, long before state governments, long before anyone thought to divide up the land with metal stakes and legal documents. That's when I understood. These weren't just random ghosts haunting the forest. They were Cherokee surveyors, still protecting land that had been taken from their people over a century ago. The phantom boundaries they were marking followed the original tribal territory, the sacred spaces that had been home to their ancestors for thousands of years. "Look," I said, raising my hands to show I wasn't threatening them. "I'm not here to take your land. I'm just trying to find out what happened to Crawford." The lead surveyor turned to his companions and spoke rapidly in Cherokee. They nodded and began spreading out, moving to surround me. Each one pulled stakes from their belt, holding them like weapons. I grabbed my pack and started running. Behind me, I heard them give chase, but their footsteps didn't sound right. Instead of the normal thud of boots on earth, it was more like wind through trees, or watt, or flowing over rocks. When I looked back, they seemed to glide between the trees without moving their legs, covering impossible distances in seconds. I reached my truck just as the sun was setting, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, and I floored the accelerator, not caring about the icy road conditions. In my rearview mirror, I saw them standing at the edge of the clearing, 3 pale figures watching me go, their empty eye sockets somehow still managing to convey disappointment. I made it about 2 miles before I had to stop. Not because of engine trouble or ice on the road, but because the road itself was wrong. According to my map, the logging road ran straight down the ridge for 12 miles before connecting with the main highway. But the road I was on curved sharply to the left, then split into 3 different paths, none of which were marked on any map I'd ever seen. I tried the GPS again. It showed me driving through empty space, following roads that didn't exist to reach destinations that had no names. The phantom surveyors hadn't just been protecting their boundaries, they'd been redrawing them. And somehow I was now trapped inside their version of the territory, subject to Cherokee property law instead of the federal boundaries I'd spent my career enforcing. I pulled the truck over and tried to think rationally. 16 years of ranger experience, 4 years of engineering school, and a lifetime of believing only in what could be measured and proven. There had to be a logical explanation. But when I stepped out of the truck, my compass started spinning so fast it looked like a drill bit. The GPS showed my elevation as negative 300 feet, which would put me somewhere below the groundwater table. And the temperature, which should have been near freezing, felt warm as a summer's mere day. That's when I saw the stakes. They were everywhere now, not just marking boundaries, but forming complex geometric patterns that stretched as far as I could see. Some were the wooden stakes the phantom surveyors carried. Others were made of materials I didn't recognize, bone maybe, or carved stone that seemed to glow in the twilight. Each stake was connected to the others by thin lines of light, like someone had strung Christmas lights between them. The lines formed a vast network across the forest, pulsing with a soft blue glow that seemed to follow some kind of rhythm. I pulled out my camera to document what I was seeing, but the viewfinder showed only normal forest. No stakes, no lights, no geometric patterns, just trees and underbrush in the gathering darkness. "What the hell is happening to me?" I said out loud. A voice answered from behind me. "You're seeing the true boundaries for the first time." I spun around. Standing 20 feet away was the lead phantom surveyor, but he looked different now. More solid, more real. His empty eye sockets had been replaced by dark, intelligent eyes that seemed ancient beyond measure. "You speak English," I said. "I speak many languages. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, English too, when I need to." His voice still had that echoing quality, but it was clearer now, easier to understand. "My name was Joseph Ridge. I was a surveyor for my people before the government sent us west." Joseph Ridge. I knew that name from the history books. He'd been one of the Cherokee leaders who signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, agreeing to move the tribe to Oklahoma in exchange for money and western land. His own people had considered him a traitor for it. "You died over 100 years ago," I said. "The body died, yes, but the responsibility remains. The land remembers its true owners, even when the law forgets." He gestured toward the network of glowing stakes. "Your friend Crawford was trying to impose false boundaries on sacred ground. The land rejected him. You killed him." Ridge shook his head. "The land led him. I only tried to show him the truth. But he couldn't accept what he was seeing. His mind broke." I looked back toward where I'd found Crawford's body. The notebook. He kept writing wrong boundaries over and over. "Because they are wrong. Every boundary marker your government has placed here violates treaties that are older than your nation. Every property line cuts through burial grounds and sacred sites that have been protected for thousands of years." Ridge walked closer, and I could see through him now, like he was made of mist and starlight. "You have a choice, Scout Talmadge. You can accept the true boundaries and leave this place in peace. Or you can fight them, like your friend did, and let the land decide your fate." "What true boundaries?" "The Cherokee were removed in 1838. This is federal land now." "Federal land." Ridge's voice turned cold. "Land that was stolen through lies and broken promises. Land that was paid for with the blood of innocents on the trail of tears." The geometric pattern of stakes pulsed brighter. "But blood calls to blood, and promises made to the earth cannot be broken by human law." The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate like a massive machine was running underneath the forest. Trees swayed without wind, and the air itself seemed to thicken. Last chance, surveyor, Ridge said. Acknowledge the true boundaries, or become part of them. I looked at my surveying equipment, at the maps and GPS units and compasses that had been my tools for over 20 years. All of them were useless here, unable to measure something that existed beyond the physical world. But I was still a ranger, still responsible for protecting this land and the people who used it. If I acknowledge your boundaries, I said, what happens to the federal claim? What happens to the people who have legal rights here? Legal rights, Ridge laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your people spoke of legal rights when they took our children to boarding schools. Legal rights when they banned our language and our ceremonies. Legal rights when they marched us off our homeland at gunpoint. The network of stakes pulsed again, and I felt something pulling at me. Not physically, but something deeper, like the land itself was trying to claim me, to make me part of its ancient memory. But, Ridge continued, we are not like your people. We do not seek revenge, only justice. Accept the boundaries as they truly are, and you can leave. Tell your government that this place is protected and no more surveyors will be needed. The pulling sensation got stronger. I could feel my feet sinking into the earth, not physically but spiritually. Like I was becoming rooted to this place, becoming part of the eternal survey that the Phantom Cherokee had been conducting for over a century. I had seconds to decide. Accept Ridge's terms and abandon everything I'd believed about law and property and federal authority. Or resist and end up like Crawford, another casualty of a boundary dispute that had been going on since before my grandfather was born. Looking at Ridge's ancient, patient eyes, I finally understood. This wasn't about property law or government authority. It was about respect, about acknowledging that some boundaries run deeper than legal documents, deeper than human law. I accept, I said. The pulling sensation stopped immediately. The geometric pattern of stakes faded to a soft glow, and Ridge nodded with something that might have been approval. You are wise for a government man, he said. The land will remember your choice. What happens now? I asked. Now you go home. You write your report. You tell your supervisors that the boundary dispute cannot be resolved through normal surveying methods. Ridge was already starting to fade, becoming translucent again. You tell them the Cherokee claim is valid and this land must remain protected. They'll want proof, evidence. Give them Crawford's notebook. Tell them what you found here. Some will believe you, some will not. But the word will spread, and eventually, someone with authority will listen. Ridge was almost completely transparent now, like morning mist. And Scout Talmadge, if other surveyors come here, you must warn them. Not everyone will be given a choice. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the forest with my broken instruments and my racing heart. The drive back down the ridge was normal. The roads were exactly where they should be. My GPS worked perfectly, and my compass pointed true north. It was like the phantom boundaries had never existed. But I knew they were still there, invisible to my instruments, but real as the trees and rocks and streams. I could feel them humming beneath the surface of the physical world, a vast network of territorial claims that had never been surrendered, only temporarily hidden. I wrote my report exactly as Ridge had instructed. Crawford's death was listed as a heart attack brought on by extreme stress and disorientation. The boundary dispute was classified as unresolvable due to conflicting territorial claims and insufficient historical documentation. My supervisors weren't happy, but they couldn't argue with Crawford's notebook or the photographic evidence of the moved boundary markers. The 40-acre disputed area was quietly reclassified as culturally sensitive land and removed from all future development consideration. 3 months later, I was transferred to a different district. No explanation given, but I understood. Some knowledge is too dangerous for government employees to carry. That was nearly 50 years ago now. I'm retired, living in a cabin not far from Holly Springs, and I still think about that December night when I learned that the world has boundaries that can't be surveyed with any human tool. Sometimes when I'm walking in the woods, I hear tier, the sound of measuring chains dragging through the leaves. And sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I see them, the phantom surveyors, still working, still protecting the true, boundaries of their ancestral land. I never told anyone the full story, never explained exactly what I saw up on that ridge. But word gets around in small communities, and the local Cherokee families know. They've started leaving offerings at the edge of the disputed area, tobacco and cornmeal, traditional gifts for the spirits of their ancestors. The land remembers, Joseph Ridge had said. And now I understand what he meant. Some boundaries are written not in legal documents, but in blood and tears, and the eternal memory of the earth itself. The Mississippi Ridge Phantom isn't just a ghost story. It's a reminder that true ownership can't be measured in acres or defined by government surveys. It runs deeper than law, older than nations, and stronger than any stake a human surveyor could ever drive into the ground. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I can still hear them working, the phantom surveyors of the Cherokee Nation, forever marking the boundaries that really matter, the ones that will never appear on any map I was trained to read. My name is Abraham Hutchinson, but everyone calls me River. I've been working the Wayne National Forest for 19 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the Ohio River could throw at me. Turns out I was wrong. It was May of 1989, and the spring floods were the worst I'd ever seen. The Ohio was running mean and muddy, swollen with snow melt from up north and 3 weeks of steady rain. Water was everywhere it shouldn't be, creeping up into the campgrounds, washing out trails, turning peaceful creeks into angry torrents. I'd spent the morning at the Marietta Unit headquarters going over flood charts with my supervisor, Dan Morrison. The numbers didn't make sense. Water levels were rising faster than they should, even with all the rain we'd been getting. "River, you need to get out to the Covered Bridge campground," Dan said, tapping his pencil on the desk. "We've got reports of flooding there, but according to these elevation maps, that area should be high and dry." I loaded up my truck with emergency supplies and headed out. The drive normally took 20 minutes, but with all the detours around washed-out roads, it took me nearly an hour. The forest felt different that day, quieter. Even with all the water rushing everywhere, the birds weren't singing much. The few animals I saw looked spooked, like they were running from something. When I finally reached the campground, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Water was flowing uphill. I'm not talking about some optical illusion or trick of the light. The Ohio River was actually flowing backward, sending water up a slope that rose 15 feet above the normal floodplain. I parked my truck and walked to the edge of the impossible flood. The water was dark and still, like a mirror. No current, no ripples, just perfect stillness that reflected the gray sky above. But I could hear something underneath. A low amming sound, almost like singing. "You seeing this too, or am I losing my mind?" I turned around to find Tom Bradley, one of the local fishermen who'd been coming to these waters for 40 years. His face was pale and his hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. "I've never seen anything like it," I admitted. "How long has it been like this?" "Started about 2 hours ago," Tom said. "I was setting up my gear down by the normal water line when I heard this sound. Like voices, you know? Singing in a language I never heard before. Then the water just changed direction." I pulled out my radio to call headquarters, but all I got was static. That was strange. We'd just upgraded our communication system, and it worked perfectly in all weather conditions. Tom and I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just staring at the impossible water. That's when we saw the first sign that something was really wrong. A deer came crashing through the trees, running full speed toward the water. But instead of stopping at the edge like any sensible animal would do, it kept going. It ran right into the water and disappeared beneath the surface without even trying to swim. "Did you see that?" Tom whispered. Before I could answer, we heard a splash from the other side of the flooded area. Something big had just entered the water. The surface rippled outward in perfect circles, but we couldn't see what had caused it. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't the normal earthy scent of river water. This was something else. Old and musty, like wet stones that had been underwater for centuries. And underneath that, there was something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. "Tom, I think we should get out of here," I said. But when I turned around, Tom was gone. His cigarette was still burning on the ground where he'd been standing, but he had vanished completely. Bleh. I called his name, but the only answer was that low humming sound coming from the water. I grabbed my emergency gear and headed back toward my truck, but the path I'd walked just minutes before was now underwater. The impossible flood was spreading, and it was spreading fast. As I looked for another way out, I noticed something carved into a big oak tree near the water's edge. The marks looked fresh, like someone had just finished cutting them. They formed a pattern I'd never seen before, circles and lines that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The humming from the water was getting louder now, and I could almost make out words. They weren't in English, but somehow I felt like I should understand them, like they were calling to me, inviting me to come closer to the still, dark water. That's when I knew I was dealing with something that had nothing to do with weather patterns or flood control. Something had been sleeping in these waters, and the spring floods had woken it up. I managed to find a deer trail that led away from the spreading water. My hands were shaking as I tried my radio again, but still nothing but static. The impossible flood was following me, creeping through the forest in ways that water just doesn't move. 20 minutes later, I reached the old mining road that runs along the ridge. From up there, I could see the whole valley, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The Ohio River wasn't just flowing backward in one spot. It was doing it in at least 6 different places that I could see. The water was forming patterns, like someone was drawing with it. My truck was still parked where I'd left it, but now it was sitting in 3 feet of dark water that definitely hadn't been there when I'd arrived. The water was so still it looked solid, like black glass. I was trying to figure out how to get to my truck when I heard a voice calling my name. "River! River! Over here!" It was Tom Bradley's voice, but it was coming from the direction of the water. I looked down and saw him standing waist-deep in the impose. Sybil Flood, waving at me like nothing strange was happening. "Tom, get out of there," I shouted back, but he just smiled and beckoned for me to come down. "It's fine, River. The water's warm, really warm, and there's something down here you need to see." Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to go anywhere near that water, but Tom was my friend. He'd helped me out more than once when I was new to the area. I couldn't just leave him. I made my way down the slope, testing each step carefully. The closer I got to the water, the stronger that sweet, cloying smell became. And the humming was louder now. Definitely voices, singing in harmony. "Tom, we need to get out of here," I said when I reached the water's edge. "Something's not right." But when I looked at Tom more closely, I realized something was very wrong. His skin had a strange, pale quality to it, like he'd been underwater for hours. And his eyes, they were completely black, reflecting the dark water around him. "Come in, River," he said, and his voice sounded different, hollow, like it was coming from far away. "The Watcher wants to meet you." That's when I saw something moving beneath the surface behind Tom. Something big and long, like a snake, but thicker than any snake I'd ever seen. It coiled around Tom's legs, but he didn't seem to notice. I stepped backward, but my foot slipped on the muddy bank. I fell hard, my equipment scattered everywhere. When I looked up, Tom was gone. The water was perfectly still again, like he'd never been there at all. But floating on the surface where he'd been standing was his fishing hat, the old blue cap he'd worn every day for as long as I'd known him. I grabbed my gear and ran. Behind me, I could hear the water moving, following me up the slope. It made a sound like whispers, like dozens of voices all talking at once in that strange language I couldn't understand. I didn't stop running until I reached the mining road. When I finally looked back, the water had stopped just short of the tree line, forming a perfect circle around the area where I'd seen Tom disappear. My truck was still trapped in the flood, but I found an old Forest Service radio in the maintenance shed nearby. It took me 20 minutes to get it working, and when I finally raised headquarters, Dan's voice crackled through the static. "River, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you for hours." "Dan, we've got a situation out here. The river's flowing backward, and Tom Bradley is missing. I think he might be—" I stopped. How could I explain what I'd seen? "River, you're not making sense. According to our readings, water levels in your area are normal, and I just talked to Tom Bradley an hour ago. He called to report some strange bird behavior near the campground. That's impossible, Dan. I saw him disappear into the water. There was a long pause. River, I need you to come back to headquarters. Right now. I looked down at the impossible flood surrounding my truck. The water was so still it looked like a painting. But I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, long serpentine forms that seemed to be watching me. Dan, I can't get to my truck. It's surrounded by water that shouldn't be there. River, there's no flood warning for your area. The river's running high, but it's nowhere near flood stage. I stared at the dark water, trying to make sense of what Dan was telling me. According to him, none of this was happening, but I could see it with my own eyes. I could smell that sweet, ancient scent. I could hear the voices singing just beneath the surface. That's when I realized the truth. Whatever was in that water didn't want the outside world to know about it. It was hiding itself, making sure that only certain people could see what was really happening. And for some reason, it wanted me to see. As the sun began to set, the voices in the water grew louder. They were calling my name now, mixing it with words in that strange language. And underneath it all, I could hear Tom's voice telling me to come closer, to come into the warm, dark water where the watcher was waiting. I spent that night in the maintenance shed, listening to the impossible flood creep closer and closer to my hiding place. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Tom's voice calling from the water. When dawn finally came, I looked out the shed window and saw that the flood had receded back to the river's normal boundaries. My truck was sitting on dry ground like nothing had happened. But when I walked over to examine it, I found things that shouldn't have been there. The entire vehicle was covered in a thin layer of river silt, and there were strange marks on the hood, the same circular patterns I'd seen carved into the oak tree. And wrapped around my radio antenna was a piece of Tom's fishing line, still wet. I drove back to headquarters, trying to figure out how to explain what I'd seen. Dan was waiting for me with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. You look like hell, River. What happened out there? I told him everything. The backward flowing water, Tom's disappearance, the voices singing beneath the surface. Dan listened without interrupting, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. River, I've known you for 8 years. You're the most level-headed guy I've ever worked with. But what you're describing, he shook his head. Maybe you need to take a few days off. This job can get to people sometimes. Before I could argue, the phone rang. Dan answered it, and I watched his face go pale. When? He asked. How many? A long pause. We'll be right there. He hung up and looked at me. That was the sheriff's department. They found 3 more people missing from the campground area. All of them were last seen near the river. We drove out together, along with Sheriff Pete K. Owalski and 2 of his deputies. The campground looked normal in the daylight, no sign of the impossible flood I'd witnessed. But there were other signs that something was wrong. All the birds were gone. The forest was completely silent except for the sound of the river running normally through its banks. And every dog in the area was acting strange, barking constantly, refusing to go near the water, cowering whenever their owners tried to take them for walks. Here's where we found the last evidence, Sheriff Kowalski said, leading us to a picnic table near the water's edge. On the table were 3 sets of car keys, 2 wallets, and a woman's purse. Looks like they just got up and walked away, leaving everything behind. I examined the items while Dan and the sheriff talked. The wallets belonged to a couple from Columbus, Mark and Sandra Chen, both in their 30s. The purse belonged to a local woman named Betty Summers, who worked at the tackle shop in town. But it was what I found underneath the picnic table that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden bench were those same circular patterns, and they were still damp with river water, even though the nearest part of the Ohio was 50 yards away. Sheriff, look at this, I called. But when he and Dan came over, they couldn't see the markings. To them, the bench looked perfectly normal. River, there's nothing there, Dan said gently. I ran my fingers over the carved symbols, feeling the rough edges where someone had cut deep into the wood. But Dan and the sheriff were staring at me like I was losing my mind. That's when I understood. Just like the impossible flood, only certain people could see the signs. The watcher was choosing who could witness its presence. We spent the rest of the day searching the area. The deputies found footprints leading to the water's edge, but the tracks just stopped at the riverbank. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The missing people had simply walked into the Ohio River and vanished. As the sun began to set, I convinced Dan to let me stay over. Night at the campground. I told him I wanted to keep watch in case the missing people came back. What I really wanted was to see if the impossible flood would return. I set up my camping gear near the picnic table and waited. Around midnight, I heard the first signs that something was happening. The normal sounds of the river, the gentle gurgling and splashing, suddenly stopped. The water became completely silent. Then I heard the singing. It started as a low humming, like I'd heard before, but gradually grew into a full chorus of voices. They were singing in that strange language, but this time I could understand some of the words. They were singing about the old times, when the river ran free and the land belonged to those who understood its power. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the water. The beam cut through the darkness, and what I saw there nearly stopped my heart. The missing people were standing in the river, waist-deep in water that glowed with a soft blue-green light. Mark and Sandra Chen stood hand in hand, their faces peaceful and blank. Betty Summers was there too, along with two other people I didn't recognize. And behind them all, barely visible in the deeper water, was Tom Bradley. They were all singing, their voices joining with the ancient chorus that rose from beneath the surface. Their eyes were completely black, just like Tom's had been, and their skin had that same pale, underwater quality. "River," Tom called out when he saw me. "Come join us. The Watcher has been waiting for you." I aimed my flashlight deeper into the river, trying to see what they were looking at. The beam penetrated the glowing water for maybe 10 feet before it hit something solid, something huge. It was like looking at the side of a building, but made of scales and flesh. The thing was so big I couldn't see where it ended. And as I watched, part of it moved, a section that might have been a head, turning slowly toward me. Two eyes opened in the depths of the river. They were each the size of car tires, glowing with the same blue-green light as the water. And when they focused on me, I felt a presence in my mind, ancient and powerful and utterly alien. "You have seen," a voice said inside my head. "You have witnessed what others cannot. Now you must choose." The missing people turned toward me in unison, their black eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. They raised their arms, inviting me to join them in the glowing water. "Come to us," the voice continued. "Become part of the river. Help us protect what must be protected." I took a step backward, but my feet felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. The singing grew louder, more insistent. The glowing water began to creep up the bank toward me, defying gravity and logic. That's when I saw the carved symbols on the picnic table begin to glow with the same blue-green light. They pulsed in rhythm with the singing, and I realized they weren't just random markings. They were some kind of summoning circle, drawing the Watcher's power up from the depths of the river. I had maybe 30 seconds before the water reached me. 30 seconds to figure out how to break whatever spell was pulling me toward the impossible creature in the Ohio River. I fought against the pull of the Watcher's voice in my head and stumbled backward from the advancing water. My boot caught on something buried in the dirt, a piece of old metal, rusted and sharp. When I bent down to free myself, I realized what I'd found. It was a surveyor's marker from the 1800s, the kind they used to mark property boundaries and sacred sites. And carved into its surface were symbols that looked exactly like the ones on the picnic table, except these were much older and worn smooth by time. The marker was ice-cold to the touch, and holding it seemed to clear my head. The Watcher's voice became fainter, and I could think more clearly about what was happening. This wasn't just some random river monster. He Watcher had been here for centuries, maybe longer. It was tied to specific places along the Ohio River, sacred sites that had been marked and protected by people who understood its power. The impossible floods weren't attacks. They were the Watcher trying to protect those sites from being disturbed. And the missing people weren't victims. They were guardians, chosen to help preserve something that was older than the United States itself. But why me? Why was I one of the few who could see what was really happening? Because you understand the river, the voice said in my head, gentler now. Because you have spent your life protecting these waters. Because you care. The glowing water had stopped its advance about 10 feet from where I stood. The missing people were still singing, but they weren't trying to force me to join them anymore. They were waiting for me to make a choice. I looked at the surveyor's marker in my hands and finally understood what it was for. The symbols weren't a summoning circle, they were a warning. A message left by previous guardians to mark the boundaries between the normal world and the Watcher's domain. "What do you want from me?" I asked out loud. Tom stepped forward in the glowing water. When he spoke, his voice was his own again, not the hollow echo I'd heard before. "The river is changing, River," he said. "People are coming who don't understand what they're dealing with. They want to build dams and change the course of the water. They want to dig up the old places and put in marinas and shopping centers." I thought about the development projects I'd heard about, the plans to modernize this section of the Ohio River Valley, strip malls and boat launches where ancient forests had stood for centuries. "The Watcher has been sleeping for 50 years, Tom continued, but now it has to wake up to protect what's left, and it needs people who understand both worlds, the old ways and the new ones." The massive eyes in the depths of the river blinked slowly, and I felt the creature's ancient intelligence studying me. It wasn't evil or malicious. It was tired and desperate, watching its domain shrink year by year as the modern world encroached on the wild places. "You can choose to help," the voice in my head said, "or you can choose to forget, but you cannot choose to do nothing." I understood now why I could see the impossible floods and the others couldn't. The Watcher was showing me what it could do, how it could manipulate water and weather to protect the places it guarded. But it was also showing me the cost. Every time it had to act directly, people got hurt or went missing. "There has to be another way," I said. "Some way to protect these places without people disappearing." Tom smiled, and for a moment he looked like his old self again. "That's why it chose you, River. Because you always try to find the middle path." The Watcher's eyes closed, and when they opened again, I saw something different in their depths. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. "Show them," the voice said. "Help them understand. Guard the boundaries so that I do not have to." The glowing water began to recede back toward the river's normal banks. The missing people waded deeper into the current, their forms becoming translucent as they merged with the Watcher's ancient presence. But Tom paused at the edge of the light. "The markers," he said. "There are 12 of them along this stretch of the river. Find them. Protect them. Keep people away from the sacred places, and the Watcher will sleep again." "What about you?" I asked. "What about the others?" "We're part of the river now," Tom said. "We're still here, just different. We'll help when we can. But the real work has to be done by someone who can still walk in both worlds." The blue-green light faded, and the river returned to its normal dark flow. I was alone on the bank with my flashlight and the cold metal of the surveyor's marker, still clutched in my hand. But I wasn't really alone. I could feel the Watcher's presence in the depths of the Ohio, patient and watchful. And I could sense the others too, Tom and the missing people, now part of something larger and older than anything I'd imagined. I had a choice to make. I could report what I'd seen and let the authorities deal with it. They'd probably think I'd had a breakdown and put me on medical leave. The development projects would go forward, and the Watcher would have to surface again to protect its territory. Or I could become what Tom had called me, a guardian of the boundaries between the old world and the new one. I looked at the symbols on the surveyor's marker, and for the first time I could read them clearly. They told a story of people who had made the same choice I was facing now, century after century, whenever the balance between human progress and ancient power was threatened. The marker grew warm in my hands, and I felt the weight of their legacy settling on my shoulders. I had work to do. That was 36 years ago. I'm retired now, but I still live in the same house by the Ohio River, People think I'm just a crazy old man who tells stories about river monsters, and I'm happy to let them think that. But I kept my promise to the watcher. I found all 12 surveyors' markers over the years, scattered along a 60-mile stretch of the river. Each one marked a sacred site, places where the water ran deeper and older than science could explain. I made sure those places stayed protected, sometimes through official channels, sometimes through more creative means. A few times developers tried to build on the marked land anyway. Those projects never went well. Equipment would malfunction, permits would get mysteriously delayed, and investors would suddenly get cold feet. The river had its ways of protecting itself, and I learned to work with those currents instead of against them. I never saw Tom again, not the way he used to be. But sometimes when I'm out fishing at dawn, I catch glimpses of shapes moving in the deeper water. And occasionally, when tourists get too close to the sacred sites, they report seeing a friendly local fisherman who warns them away from dangerous currents. The descriptions always sound like Tom. The other missing people became part of the river's protection too. Mark and Sandra Chen helped guide lost boaters away from the hidden dangers. Betty Summers made sure the tackle shops never sold certain areas as safe fishing spots. They found ways to serve as guardians while still looking out for the living. I trained 3 successors over the years, people who could see the signs and understood the responsibility. 2 of them are still active, watching over different sections of the river. The third decided the burden was too much and chose to forget. The watcher respected that choice, though I sometimes wonder if she really forgot or just pretends she did. The hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was learning to live with the knowledge that the world is much stranger and more wonderful than most people realize. There are forces older than human civilization still moving through the wild places, and sometimes those forces need help from people who can walk between the old ways and the new ones. I kept detailed journals of everything I learned about the Watcher and the sacred sites. When I'm gone, those records will go to the next generation of guardians. The knowledge has to survive, even if the people who carry it don't. Last month, a new development company started looking at land near marker number 7. They want to build a luxury resort right on top of one of the most sensitive areas. I've been working to discourage them through normal channels, but if that doesn't work, I'll have to try other methods. The funny thing is, I never felt like I gave up a normal life to become a guardian. If anything, understanding the deeper currents of the river made my life richer and more meaningful. I learned that protecting something ancient and powerful is its own kind of purpose. Sometimes, late at night when the river is running high, I can hear the old songs drifting up from the depths. The Watcher is still down there, patient and watchful, dreaming the long dreams of things that existed before humans built their first cities. And sometimes I dream along with it, seeing the river as it was centuries ago, wild and free, with great forests coming down to the water's edge and ancient peoples who understood that some places are too sacred to change. Those dreams remind me why the work matters, why some boundaries need to be guarded, even if the guardians are never thanked or understood. The Ohio River still flows past my house every day, carrying its secrets toward the Mississippi and the sea. To most people, it's just water and current, and the occasional barge hauling coal downstream. But I know better. I know that beneath the surface, in the deep places where sunlight never reaches, something old and powerful is still watching over the wild places that remain. And as long as people like me are willing to stand guard at the boundaries between worlds, the Watcher can keep sleeping peacefully in the depths of the river it has protected for countless generations. The water flows on, as it always has, carrying both ancient secrets and modern dreams toward whatever future awaits downstream. Final word count: 4,847 words. Approximately 16 to 17 minutes reading time. My name is Douglas Beauregard, but everyone at the ranger station calls me Machete on account of how I hack through the thick stuff that shouldn't be growing in our forests. I've been working these South Carolina woods for 18 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything nature could throw at me. Boy, was I wrong. It was September 1983. And the heat was killing everything. We hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks, and the temperature was stuck at 95 degrees every single day. The drought made my job easier in some ways, less growth to cut back. But it also made the invasive plants desperate and aggressive, fighting harder for what little water was left in the ground. I specialize in invasive species control for the Sumter National Forest, specifically the Andrew Pickens District. Most folks don't realize how much damage foreign plants can do to our native ecosystem. They think a plant is just a plant, but I learned different in Vietnam. Spent 2 years over there spraying Agent Orange on jungle canopies, watching how chemicals could strip entire forests bare in a matter of days. When I came back, I figured I'd use that knowledge for good instead of destruction. The kudzu was the worst problem we had. That stuff came from Japan back in the 1930s, and now it was eating our forests alive. People called it foot-a-night vine because of how fast it grew, covering everything like a green blanket of death. Trees, houses, abandoned cars, the kudzu didn't care. It just kept growing and growing until it strangled the life out of everything underneath. That morning, I loaded my truck with the usual gear: machete, handsaw, brush cutter, herbicide sprayer, and enough water for a full day in the heat. My assignment was the Chattooga River corridor, way back in the gorge where most tourists never went. The district supervisor, Bill Henderson, had gotten reports from some hikers about kudzu growth that seemed unusual, whatever that meant. Probably just city folks who never seen kudzu before, I told Bill as I signed out the equipment. Maybe, he said, not looking up from his paperwork, but go check it out anyway. Trail access only, so you'll be hiking in about 3 miles from the Burroughs Ford parking area. I'd worked that section before. The Chattooga was designated as a wild and scenic river, which meant we had to be extra careful about what chemicals we used and how we managed the vegetation. It was also some of the most isolated country in South Carolina. Thick forest, steep ravines, and no cell phone coverage for miles in any direction. The drive out to Burroughs Ford took about an hour, winding through mountain roads that got narrower and more rutted the farther I went from civilization. I passed maybe 3 other vehicles the whole way, and by the time I reached the trailhead, I felt like I was at the edge of the world. The parking area was empty except for one beat-up sedan with North Carolina plates. Probably belonged to some college kids on a camping trip. I shouldered my pack, grabbed my tools, and started down the trail toward the river. The forest was quiet in a way that made me uneasy. Usually, even in the heat, you'd hear birds calling, insects buzzing, squirrels chattering in the trees. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the only sound was my boots crunching on dry leaves and the distant whisper of the river far below. About a mile in, I started noticing the kudzu. At first it looked normal enough. Thick green vines climbing up the oak and pine trees, forming the usual suffocating canopy. But something about the pattern was different. Instead of the random, chaotic growth I was used to seeing, these vines seemed almost organized, like they were following some kind of plan. I stopped at a particularly large oak tree that was completely covered in kudzu from roots to top branches. The vine coverage was so thick and uniform that it looked like someone had wrapped the tree in green fabric. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was that all the vines seemed to be growing in the same direction, pointing deeper into the forest like a bunch of green arrows. "That's weird," I said out loud, just to hear my own voice in the unnatural quiet. I took out my notebook and sketched the growth pattern, making notes about the direction and density of the coverage. In 18 years of fighting invasive plants, I'd never seen kudzu grow in such a deliberate-looking formation. It was probably just coincidence. Maybe the soil conditions or water drainage created some kind of natural orientation, but it was worth documenting. As I continued down the trail, the kudzu got thicker and weirder. Whole sections of forest were buried under green mounds that rose and fell like sleeping giants. The native trees were completely hidden, creating a landscape that looked more like giant green sculptures than a natural forest. By the time I reached the river, I was sweating through my uniform and starting to feel genuinely disturbed by what I was seeing. The kudzu coverage along the riverbank was the heaviest I'd ever encountered. It formed a solid wall of green that extended from the water's edge up the steep slopes on both sides of the gorge. And again, there was that strange uniformity to the growth pattern, like the whole mass of vines was growing according to some invisible blueprint. I set down my pack and pulled out my camera to document the scene. Through the viewfinder, the kudzu-covered landscape looked even more alien and threatening. There were no gaps in the green coverage, no signs of the native plants that should have been growing along the riverbank. It was like the kudzu had erased the original forest and replaced it with something completely foreign. That's when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. A soft rustling that seemed to come from inside the green wall itself, like something large was moving around in there. I lowered the camera and listened, but the sound had stopped. "Hello?" I called out, thinking maybe it was the owners of that car I'd seen at the trailhead. No answer, just the quiet murmur of the water flowing over rocks. I walked along the riverbank looking for a good spot to start cutting back the kudzu overgrowth. The rustling sound came again, this time from a different location about 50 feet upstream. It sounded like footsteps, but muffled and strange, like someone walking on thick carpet. "Is somebody there?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer or wild turkey moving around in the undergrowth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside that green wall. After 18 years in these woods, you develop instincts about when you're alone and when you're not. And right then, I definitely didn't feel alone. I decided to start my work about 100 yards upstream from where I'd heard the rustling. The kudzu there had completely swallowed a grove of young dogwood trees, creating a green dome about 20 feet high and 40 feet across. It was exactly the kind of invasive growth that was destroying our native ecosystem, and it would make a good test site for the new herbicide mixture I'd been wanting to try. I put on my protective gear, goggles, respirator, thick gloves, and started up the gas-powered brush cutter. The engine noise shattered the forest quiet, and I felt a little better having something familiar and mechanical to focus on. The outer layer of kudzu came away easily, revealing the suffocated dogwoods underneath. But as I cut deeper into the mass of vines, I started finding things that didn't make sense. The first strange thing was how the vines were arranged around the trees. Instead of just climbing, up randomly like kudzu usually does, these vines had wrapped around the tree trunks in perfect spirals, like someone had trained them to grow in decorative patterns. The spirals were all identical. 7 complete turns around each trunk, always moving clockwise from bottom to top. I shut off the brush cutter and examined one of the wrapped trees more closely. The vine spirals were so tight and uniform that they looked almost like rope bindings. And underneath the vines, the dogwood bark was completely stripped away, exposing the white wood beneath. It was like the kudzu had been slowly strangling and eating the trees at the same time. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling out my notebook to document this bizarre growth pattern. That's when I found the bones. They were scattered around the base of the largest dogwood, partially hidden under a carpet of kudzu leaves. At first, I thought they might be from a deer that had died naturally and been overgrown by the vines. But when I brushed away the leaves and examined them more carefully, I realized they were too small for deer, and they were arranged in a rough circle around the tree, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I'm no expert on animal remains, but these bones looked fresh, probably no more than a few weeks old. There were leg bones, ribs, what looked like part of a skull. The skull fragment was the wrong shape for any animal I knew, too round and smooth. Almost like... I pushed that thought away. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe a large dog had gotten lost in the woods and died. Maybe the bones had been scattered by scavengers and just happened to end up in a circular pattern. But as I looked around the grove more carefully, I found 2 more bone circles under other kudzu-wrapped trees. Same arrangement, same types of bones, same fresh appearance. 3 dead animals in the same small area, all arranged the same way. That wasn't natural behavior for any scavenger I knew about. I was starting to feel seriously spooked, but I told myself to focus on the job. Document every thing, collect samples, let the wildlife biologists figure out what had happened to these animals. I wasn't paid to solve mysteries. I was paid to kill invasive plants. I started the brush cutter again and went back to clearing the kudzu, but I couldn't shake the image of those bone circles from my mind. And as I worked, I kept getting the feeling that something was moving just outside my field of vision. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there but more green wall of vines. About an hour later, I heard voices coming from downstream. Real human voices this time, not the weird rustling sounds from before. I shut off the cutter and listened. It sounded like two people, maybe three, calling to each other. Their voices had an edge of panic to them. "Help! Somebody help us!" I dropped my tools and ran toward the sound, crashing through the undergrowth along the riverbank. The voices were coming from somewhere inside the kudzu wall, but I couldn't see any opening or trail that would lead in there. "Where are you?" I shouted. "Keep calling so I can find you." "We're stuck," came the reply, a young woman's voice. "The vines are too thick. We can't get out." I followed the voice to a section of kudzu that looked slightly different from the rest. The vines seemed looser, more tangled than arranged. I started hacking through them with my machete, cutting a path toward where the voices were coming from. "Keep talking," I called. "I'm cutting through to you." But as I chopped deeper into the vines, the voices started getting fainter instead of louder. That didn't make sense. I was moving toward them, so they should have sounded closer. And then the voices stopped altogether. "Hello?" I called. "Are you still there?" Silence. I kept cutting for another 10 minutes, creating a tunnel through the kudzu about 6 feet deep. But there was no sign of any people, and no response to my calls. It was like they had just vanished. When I finally gave up and crawled back out of the vine tunnel, I found something that made my blood run cold. The opening I had cut was gone. The kudzu vines had grown back together behind me, sealing the tunnel as if it had never existed. I stood there staring at the solid wall of green, trying to process what I was seeing. Kudzu was fast-growing, but not that fast. It took days or weeks for new growth to fill in gaps, not minutes. What I was looking at was impossible. I checked my watch. I had been inside the tunnel for maybe 15 minutes total. There was no way the vines could have regrown that quickly, but there they were, thick, mature-looking vines, completely blocking the path I had just cut. That's when I started seriously considering the possibility that I was losing my mind. Maybe the heat was getting to me. Maybe I was hallucinating from dehydration or chemical exposure. Maybe I had imagined the voices entirely, but the bone circles were real. I had photographs of them, and the weird spiral growth patterns around the trees were real too. Something very strange was happening in this section of forest, and it was connected to the kudzu. I packed up my gear and decided to head back to the ranger station. I needed to report what I'd found and get some backup before I went any deeper into this area. But as I started walking back toward the trail, I heard the voices again. This time, they were coming from a completely different direction, upstream, near where I had been working earlier. 3 distinct voices, 2 male and 1 female, all calling for help. And now I could hear what they were saying more clearly. "The vines are moving!" one of the male voices shouted. "They're alive! They're trying to grab us!" I ran toward the voices, but again, as I got closer, they seemed to move away from me. It was like they were leading me somewhere, drawing me deeper into the kudzu-covered forest. And that's when I realized that the voices might not be coming from people who needed help. They might be coming from people who were already beyond help. I stopped running and listened more carefully to what the voices were saying. The same 3 phrases, repeated over and over. "Help us! We're stuck! The vines are moving!" Always in the same order, always with the same inflection, like a recording playing on loop. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my radio to call the ranger station. But when I tried to transmit, all I got was static. The radio had been working fine that morning, but now it was completely dead. And my watch had stopped at 2:17, even though I could swear it had been working just a few minutes ago. I was trapped in a section of forest where the plants grew in impossible patterns, where animal bones were arranged in ritual circles, where voices called from inside walls of vines that could seal themselves closed. And now my equipment was failing, cutting off my connection to the outside world. The smart thing would have been to leave immediately, to get out of the area and come back with a full team and better equipment. But as I started walking back toward the main trail, I heard something that stopped me cold. It was my own voice, calling from somewhere deep in the kudzu wall. "Help! Somebody help us! We're stuck!" And I realized that whatever was in this forest had been collecting voices, and now it had mine. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, listening to my own voice calling for help from inside the kudzu. The sound was perfect. Every inflection, every accent, every pause exactly right. But I was standing right there on the riverbank, so who was doing the talking? The logical part of my brain kept trying to find explanations. Maybe it was an echo effect from the river gorge. Maybe someone had recorded my voice earlier without me noticing. Maybe I really was having some kind of heat-induced breakdown. But the part of my brain that had kept me alive in Vietnam was screaming that I needed to get out of there immediately. I started walking quickly back toward the main trail, but the kudzu seemed to be fighting me every step of the way. Vines that I swore hadn't been there before were now hanging across the path at face level. Thick runners had grown across the trail itself, creating trip hazards that could easily break an ankle. And the entire forest felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. About halfway back to the trailhead, I came across something that made me stop despite every instinct telling me to keep moving. There was a small clearing in the kudzu, maybe 10 feet across, perfectly circular and completely clear of vines. In the center of the clearing was a backpack, expensive-looking hiking gear, the kind college kids use for weekend camping trips. I recognized it immediately. It was the same brand and color as the pack I'd seen in the back seat of that car at the Burrells Ford parking area. Against my better judgment, I approached the clearing. The backpack was sitting upright, perfectly positioned as if someone had just set it down and walked away. But there were no footprints in the soft earth around it, no signs that anyone had been there recently. I called out, "Hello? Is this your pack?" But got no response except the echo of my own voice bouncing off the kudzu walls. Using a long stick, I reached into the clearing and pulled the backpack toward me. I didn't want to step into that open space. Something about it felt like a trap. The pack was heavy, still loaded with gear. I opened it carefully and found the usual camping supplies: water bottles, trail mix, sleeping bag, first aid kit. But I also found something that made my stomach drop. There was a driver's license in the top pocket. The photo showed a young woman, maybe 22 years old, with long blonde hair and a bright smile. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and her address was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. There was also a permission slip from UNC allowing her to conduct botanical research in the Sumter National Forest as part of her senior thesis project. A botany student. She had come here to study plants. I kept digging through the pack and found her research notebook. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, and it described the same weird kudzu growth patterns I had been seeing. But Jennifer had noticed something I had missed. She wrote that the kudzu vines seemed to be responding to human presence, growing more actively when people were nearby. She had set up time-lapse cameras to document the vine movement, and her notes described growth rates that were physically impossible, several inches per hour instead of the normal few inches per day. Her final entry was just 2 lines. "The vines are definitely moving on their own. I'm going to stay overnight and film them in the dark. This could change everything we know about plant behavior." There were no entries after that. I looked around the clearing again, paying closer attention to the kudzu walls surrounding it. Now that I knew what to look for, I could see that the vines weren't just randomly arranged. They formed a perfect circle around the clearing, and they were all leaning inward slightly, like they were reaching toward the center, toward where Jennifer's backpack had been sitting. And that's when I noticed the cameras. They were small digital models mounted on flexible tripods and positioned at 3 points around the clearing. All 3 cameras were still running, their little red recording lights blinking steadily. Jennifer had been filming when whatever happened to her happened. I used the stick to pull one of the cameras toward me and checked the display screen. The memory card was full, hours and hours of footage. I scrolled back through the recorded timestamps, looking for the most recent footage. What I saw made me drop the camera. The screen showed the clearing at night, lit by infrared sensors. Jennifer was there, sitting by a small camp stove, writing in her notebook. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. 2 nights ago. As I watched, the kudzu vines around the clearing began to move. Not the slow, imperceptible movement of normal plant growth, but deliberate, coordinated motion like the tentacles of some enormous creature. The vines started reaching into the clearing slowly at first, then faster. Jennifer looked up from her notebook and saw them coming. She tried to stand up, tried to run, but the vines were faster. They wrapped around her ankles, her waist, her arms. She was screaming, but there was no sound on the camera footage, just the terrifying image of a young woman being dragged into the kudzu wall by living vines. The footage went on for another few minutes after she disappeared, showing the vines rearranging themselves to completely hide any trace of where she had gone. Then, impossibly, new vines grew up from the ground to replace her campsite with her abandoned backpack, positioned exactly where I had found it. I was looking at a hunting ground. The kudzu wasn't just an invasive plant. It was a predator. And Jennifer Walsh wasn't the first victim. I had to get out of there and bring back help. But as I turned to leave the clearing, I found my path blocked by a wall of kudzu that definitely hadn't been there before. The vines had grown across the trail while I was watching the camera footage, creating a barrier about 8 feet high and completely impenetrable. I tried to push through, but the vines were too thick and strong. I took out my machete and started chopping, but for every vine I cut, 2 more seemed to take its place. And worse, the vines I had already cut were growing back, healing themselves in a matter of minutes. That's when I heard Jennifer's voice calling from inside the kudzu wall. "Help! Somebody help us! The vines are moving! They're alive!" The thing had her voice now, just like it had mine. And it was using our voices to lure other people into the forest, the same way it had lured me deeper into the kudzu by moving the voices around, making me think I was chasing real people who needed help. I was trapped in a circular clearing surrounded by a living wall of vines that could heal themselves faster than I could cut them. My radio was dead, my watch had stopped, and somewhere in the kudzu around me was a predatory plant intelligence that had already killed at least 1 person and was now hunting me. The sun was starting to set, and I remembered from Jennifer's research notes that the kudzu was most active at night. I had maybe an hour of daylight left to figure out how to escape, or I was going to end up like Jennifer, another voice calling from inside the green wall, luring the next victim into the trap. I started examining the kudzu barrier more carefully, looking for any weakness or pattern I could exploit. The vines were thickest near the ground and at about head height, but there was a section about 6 feet up that looked slightly thinner. If I could climb high enough, maybe I could get over the wall before it grew up to block me. But as soon as I started climbing, the kudzu responded. New vines shot up from the base of the wall, growing vertically at a speed that looked like time-lapse photography. Within minutes, they had added another 4 feet to the height of the barrier. The thing was intelligent. It was watching me, anticipating my moves, adapting its defenses to keep me trapped. And as the sun sank lower toward the horizon, I could hear more voices joining the chorus. Not just Jennifer and me, but other voices I didn't recognize. Male and female, young and old, all calling for help from inside the kudzu. All the people who had disappeared in this forest over the years, all the hikers and campers and researchers who had come here and never come back. The South Carolina kudzu strangler had been hunting for a long time, and now it was my turn, as due. Darkness fell. The kudzu came alive. I could hear it moving all around me, a constant rustling and creaking like an enormous creature stretching its limbs. The wall surrounding the clearing grew higher and thicker, but more disturbing was the way the vines began to move with purpose, reaching into the clearing like searching fingers. I had retreated to the exact center of the open space, clutching my machete and the herbicide sprayer. The chemicals in the tank were designed to kill kudzu at the root level, but I had no idea if they would work against this mutated version of the plant. That's when I remembered something from my time in Vietnam. We hadn't just used Agent Orange to clear jungle canopies. We had used it to flush out enemy positions. The Viet Cong would hide in underground tunnels connected to the root systems of large trees. When we sprayed the defoliant, it didn't just kill the leaves. It killed the entire root network, collapsing the tunnels and forcing people out into the open. If the kudzu was operating as a connected network like a single organism spread across acres of forest, then maybe I could hurt the whole system by targeting the right spot. I started looking more carefully at the vines around the clearing, trying to identify which ones looked like the main connectors. In normal kudzu, there are always a few primary vines that serve as the structural backbone for the entire growth. Cut those, and large sections of the plant will die back. By the light of my flashlight, I could see that 3 massive vine trunks entered the clearing at roughly equal intervals around the circle. Each trunk was about as thick as my waist, and they all seemed to pulse with a rhythmic movement like blood vessels carrying nutrients through the system. Those had to be the main arteries. I mixed the strongest concentration of herbicide I dared, twice the recommended strength, and loaded it into the sprayer. If this didn't work, I was out of options. The kudzu seemed to sense what I was planning. As I approached the first main vine, the smaller vines around it began moving frantically, trying to block my access. But I had one advantage. They were trying to capture me alive, which meant they couldn't just crush me outright. I managed to get close enough to spray a full dose of herbicide directly onto the main vine trunk. The effect was immediate and horrible. The vine began to writhe and contract, and I could hear something that sounded almost like screaming coming from deep within the kudzu wall. All the voices, Jennifer's, mine, and all the others, started calling out at once, creating a chorus of anguish that echoed through the forest. The smaller vines pulled back from me, retreating toward the wall as if they were in pain. I ran to the second main vine and hit it with another dose of herbicide. The screaming got louder, and sections of the kudzu wall began to wither and turn brown. But the plant was fighting back. As I approached the third vine trunk, the entire clearing suddenly filled with reaching tendrils. They came at me from all directions. From the walls, from underground, even dropping down from above. I dodged and slashed with my machete, but there were too many of them. A thick vine wrapped around my ankle and yanked me off my feet. Another one caught my wrist, trying to pull the herbicide sprayer away from me. I could feel myself being dragged toward the kudzu wall, toward the same fate that had claimed Jennifer and all the other victims. But I still had one shot left in the sprayer. Instead of trying to reach the third main vine, I aimed the nozzle at my own feet and sprayed the herbicide in a circle around myself. The vines that were touching me immediately recoiled, releasing their grip as the chemical burned through their tissue. I scrambled to my feet and made a desperate run for the weakest section of the wall where the brown, dying vines were starting to create gaps. Behind me, the entire kudzu network was convulsing in what looked like death throes. Trees were falling as the vines that had been supporting them withered away. The ground itself seemed to be moving as underground root systems collapsed. I crashed through the dying wall and kept running, following my memory of the trail back toward the parking area. But the kudzu wasn't finished with me yet. Even as sections of it died from the herbicide, other parts were still trying to hunt me down. Living vines whipped across the trail in front of me, trying to trip me or block my escape. Overhead, kudzu-covered branches reached down like grasping hands, and through it all, the voices kept calling, but now they weren't asking for help. Now they were angry, accusatory, blaming me for destroying their shared prison of living green. I ran through the darkness for what felt like hours, guided only by my flashlight and my memory of the trail. Every shadow looked like reaching vines, every sound like pursuit. But gradually, the attacks became less frequent, and the voices faded to whispers. By the time I reached the Burrells Ford parking area, the forest behind me was quiet again. I threw my gear into the truck and drove straight to the ranger station, where I found Bill Henderson working late in his office. "Jesus, Doug, you look like hell," he said when I burst through the door. "What happened out there?" I tried to explain, but even as I was talking, I could tell how crazy it sounded. A plant that hunted people? Vines that moved like animals? Voices calling from inside the forest? Bill listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "You sure you didn't get into some bad mushrooms out there?" he finally asked. "Or maybe heat exhaustion? It was pretty hot today." I showed him the camera I had taken from Jennifer's research site, but when we played back the footage, it just showed a normal forest clearing. No moving vines, no struggling woman, no evidence of anything unusual. Either the camera had malfunctioned, or the kudzu had somehow erased the evidence. But I had proof that something had happened. Jennifer's driver's license was still in my pocket, along with pages from her research notebook. Bill agreed to file a missing person report and organize a search party for the next morning. "But Doug," he said as I was leaving, "maybe you should take a few days off, get some rest. See a doctor if you need to." I drove home through the mountain darkness, trying to convince myself that maybe Bill was right. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the heat and isolation had played tricks with my mind. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. And I knew it wasn't over. The search party found Jennifer's campsite the next morning, but there was no sign of her body or any evidence of a struggle. The official report listed her as a missing hiker, probably lost in the wilderness or fallen into the river. The case was closed within a week. I went back to the site with the search teams, but the forest looked completely normal. The kudzu was there, sure enough, but it was growing in the usual random, chaotic patterns. The circular clearing was gone, filled in with normal undergrowth. The bone circles I had found were scattered and weathered, looking like natural animal remains that had been there for months. Everything looked exactly like what you'd expect to find in any southern forest overrun with invasive kudzu. Except for one thing. The 3 main vine trunks I had poisoned were dead. Massive, ancient-looking kudzu stems, each as thick as my waist, had withered to brown husks. The Forest Service attributed it to drought stress, but I knew better. Those were the arteries I had severed, the main connections in a network that had been hunting people for who knows how long. I kept Jennifer's research notebook, and over the following weeks I did some research of my own. I found records of missing hikers and campers going back decades, all in the same general area of the Chattooga River corridor. People would park at Burrell's Ford, head into the forest, and simply vanish. Search parties would find abandoned campsites and personal belongings, but never any bodies. The pattern went back to the 1940s, right around the time when the kudzu had first been planted in South Carolina as part of a government erosion control program. 37 people had disappeared in that section of forest over 40 years. All of them had been alone or in small groups. All of them had some kind of interest in plants or nature. The thing had been feeding for decades, but now it was hurt, maybe dying. The voices had stopped calling from the forest. The missing person reports from that area dropped to 0. Whatever intelligence had been controlling the kudzu network, I had damaged it badly enough to break its hold on that section of forest. I never told anyone else about what I had really experienced out there. Who would believe me? A plant that hunted people sounded like something from a bad science fiction movie, not a real threat that needed to be taken seriously. And maybe that was for the best. Some knowledge is too dangerous to share. I kept working as a ranger for another 12 years before I retired, but I never went back to that section of the Chattooga River. I assigned those areas to other rangers, always making sure they worked in teams and carried backup communication equipment. I told them it was because of the rough terrain and poor radio coverage, which was true enough. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if I really killed the thing or just wounded it. Kudzu is incredibly resilient. It can regrow from the smallest root fragment, spread to new areas, adapt to new conditions, and intelligence, once it evolves, has a way of finding new forms. These days, I read the missing person reports from forests all across the southeast, looking for patterns that might indicate the presence of something like what I encountered. So far, the numbers look normal. Just the usual hikers who get lost or injured in the wilderness. But I keep watching, and I keep a spray bottle of concentrated herbicide in my truck, just in case. Because out there in the green darkness of our southern forests, where the kudzu grows thick and the voices call for help, something might still be waiting for the next lone researcher to wander too far from the trail. My name is Douglas Beauregard, and I'm probably the only person alive who knows that plants can learn to hunt. I just hope I'm wrong about them learning to hide.